Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online Podcast. This is going to be episode 247 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on the 16th of July, 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com. I'm going to be your main host for this podcast, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, it's going to be covering all the news from the past couple of weeks, and then we will have 3 episode reviews to cover as well. So, we'll be doing 2 ATLA episodes, 1 Korra episode. So, we're going to be doing 111, The Great Divide, 112, The Storm, and then from Korra, K108, When Extremes Meet. So, let's jump in here with the news. So, the first one is the kind of big one that's happened from the last few weeks. And that was this somewhat kind of out of the blue, random podcast interview that Mike and Bryan did on the Comic-Con Metapod. And it's a full, it's 103 minutes. It's 3 separate interview segments. The first one bit is with Janet Varney and Dante Basco. The second segment is with Jeremy Zuckerman, and then the last segment is with Mike and Bryan. So full Avatar special effectively here. And it's surprisingly revealing about Avatar Studios. It's the most open Mike and Bryan have been about things, and there's actually a decent amount of takeaways from this. Nothing huge to the point where it's major Avatar Studios news, but because of how silent things have been, it's probably the most news we've had in a very long time. So my recommendation, if you want to check out this podcast, would be that you probably don't need to listen to the Janet Varney and Dante Basco segment, unfortunately. The Jeremy Zuckerman interview, I think, is solid, but I think the main news from that is basically covered in more detail in the Mike and Bryan segment. But I think everyone should listen to the Mike and Bryan segment. So I suppose just to start off with, what are your thoughts on this kind of big Mike and Bryan significant interview out of nowhere almost?
Yeah, it did feel like it sort of came out of the blue there. I guess, they've probably been setting that up, sort of podcast up for a while, since they have so many people that are involved with the franchise to some degree. But yeah, they were, like you said, they were quite open comparatively to what we've gotten in the past, which has been pretty much nothing on that front in terms of actual news posts. So it was surprising to sort of hear them speak a little bit more open about things and responding directly to some of the news and the media and the sort of speculation that has gone around.
Mm-hmm. So the first one, I suppose, was touched on in the Jeremy Zuckerman section of this, and just, of course, they ask him what's happening with the soundtrack, and his response is basically it's the best it has ever looked by a long shot, and that stuff is happening related to the soundtrack. Later on in the Mike and Bryan segment, they're also asked about the soundtrack, and they before the question even finishes, Bryan is just like, yes, it's happening. And then they go into the detail, and they talk about how it was so close to happening so many times, but just the the information getting through the back end of all these people that it needs to go through to happen, it just sort of got lost a little bit in there. The soundtrack was one of the first things that they mentioned that they wanted to do once they got the whole Avatar Studios deal to happen, which we'll discuss in a second. Bryan mentions that he has had a few phone calls about the soundtrack. They are trying hard to make it happen. So it's good to get that and just know that, okay, they're the main 3 people that should be involved in this are trying to make it happen. And I suppose just because it is a somewhat different thing for Avatar, it having to be a CD release type thing makes it just slightly more complicated, but it looks like it's going to happen eventually. They made clear to get across the idea that this is not full on 100% confirmation that it's happening, it's not an announcement, but that they're working on it. So all but confirmed is basically the news here on the soundtrack. So what was your takeaway on what was said about the soundtrack?
Yeah, the whole like, I mean, I guess the main idea is there is just that, I think they even mentioned, just having this is like the most hope that they've had for it going forward, with everything that's worked around with it. And, they've mentioned this, like, I mean, this is like, years and years at this point that people have been asking for this. And, they've mentioned online before that it's been closer. So I don't know. I think it's nice that, this was something that they specifically said that they brought up, to the higher ups or as high as they could when they set up everything. So it definitely, in terms of, like you were saying, that it's the best that it has been, which, grain of salt with all of that considering everything. But I don't know. I mean, I would suspect it's still going to take a while, especially if, like what you're saying, they're going to continue, doing some form of physical release, which, for some people that's still a big thing, and collectors and everything like that. So I'm sure people will be willing to, go out for that, however they decide to sort of put it out. So no, I'm definitely, looking forward to it. I'm sure it'll be on all the different platforms when it comes out. I mean, I guess at this point, considering how they move with things, I wouldn't even be surprised if it like scheduled with the release of, some other media that actually comes out that's, more along the lines of something animated. So still not something that like I would be surprised if it came like this year or anything like that. But, it's good to hear them talk about it.
Mm-hmm. They talk at the start, I suppose, about how Avatar Studios sort of came about, and they kind of say that, like, in a way, it's Mike kind of made it happen, kind of basically, that, like, they were talking with Brian Robbins, who's one of the heads at Nick, and was just like, what about we do our own studio? And that's basically how it happened. They talk about how in the past, like with ATLA and Korra, they were both sort of like the odd random shows that it almost was like, why are Nick doing these shows? It doesn't fit with anything else they have. But that now they are like the perfect franchise for this kind of new era, because it's all about sort of content, franchise continuity, and Avatar's perfect for that. So interesting how kind of things have changed a lot with that. They talk about sort of their roles, I suppose, in Avatar Studios, that like they are setting the stage, getting people in to play in those sandboxes. So again, sort of highlighting that like they're going to be involved in everything, but they are not going to be like the directors on everything, like we already know with the whole Lon Montgomery announcement. So I suppose from some of this like early stuff here, what are your thoughts on what they had to say in the early sections of this interview?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of how they put this sort of, new group, new studio underneath, the umbrella of Nickelodeon, Viacom, CBS, and everything, I think it's pretty interesting just to hear, some of the backside of how these things actually sort of came to be. And, as we've already discussed that, they're not being directly involved with everything. They're just sort of overseeing things and doing, the different sort of projects out, which makes sense considering how big they're, at least hoping that everything's going to be. So it definitely sounds like the right direction for, how to actually get things organized and get things produced. And I'm sure once things are going at, sort of a more steady pace and they see, somewhat returns on everything, assuming everything is as good as we hope for everything, I'm sure it'll also sort of speed up to some degree at that as well, just that, there's more stuff coming out. But, I think I don't know, I like hearing how it actually sort of started, how it just sort of like a half sort of thing, and the fact that this is really fits our current times. I mean, I think, it's always been, known that Avatar and Korra has been sort of like the odd shows. I mean, we've mentioned that many, many times of here on the podcast before, when they went to only digital, how that was like a first, and now everything's pretty much only digital. So definitely seems like they just happen to be some forerunners on, this side of things. And it looks like, so far at least, that this has turned out towards their betterment.
Mm-hmm. Then they go into clarification on the animation style. So the news here is effectively that Brian seems to confirm that 2D is going to like remain their bread and butter, is what he says, but that they're going to use technology to help like enhance that. He doesn't go into like a lot of technical detail, but very much the clarification of 2D, and that none of their big projects at the moment will be in purely 3D, and that in terms of the whole Arcane Spider-Verse comparison, they're not trying to do that exactly. They're still doing their own thing. They're working hard to form their own look, and he said all the right things in a way. Now, he did, I think, say that with the idea that, like, it was rumors that they were doing 3D, which is a weird way to call, like, Brian Robbins, the guy who basically made Avatar Studios happening, saying the movies will be in CG as, like, rumors. But I guess he just saw fans talking about the Arcane Spider-Verse comparison so much that that's what he was mainly reacting to. But still, it kind of highlights this shift over the months in terms of what information we had, of thinking it was initially CG, then the job listing suggested it was like 2D, 3D hybrid. Now it's like 2D with technology enhancements, which I think everyone seems pretty happy with. But what are your thoughts on what Brian had to say about the animation style for Avatar Studios?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of it was just sort of quelling some of the, like, preconceived notions that people had, or fears or whatever, in terms of, like, the direction of Avatar going forward. The idea of it being, CG enhanced, or however you want to sort of discuss the sort of like integration of elements that aren't sort of your traditional sort of drawing. It sounds like it should be fine. I mean, it's it's nothing that they haven't done before. Even in like the original Avatar, they had some of that stuff in there. I think we've mentioned that on a couple of episodes we've talked about already. And obviously everything has gotten way better since it has back then, even just from Korra's times as well. So I don't know. I didn't personally have any sort of huge fears about that, although I know, it really just depends on how they produce things and how it fits within the story, if it's good or bad, and, the budgets that they have for things. So, no, I think it's good that, since their upbringing and everything in terms of like, design and animation is sort of, in 2D or, 2D digital work, it's nice that they're going to keep that going, as well as, whatever else they can do to enhance it or speed up the production workflow or anything like that. Since, at the end of the day, they do have to sort of get it out for people to actually see it, to actually, make money off of it and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Next bit is, I just have bullet points from notes that I took when I listened to this. So it's more like they have a cohesive strategy now for stories for the comics and the novels. That what I took from this was, the idea to not do certain comics if they already have a plan for a movie. Basically, I think what's happened currently with the comics, the reason that we're probably not getting continuation past Imbalance is because they know they're doing a movie that is going to be ATLA related, so they don't want to like step on the toes of all the different mediums, but they seem to have a plan for what I suppose can be done in each medium. They did mention here that they now have a story editor who is helping with continuity across stuff like, I think he mentions like the RPG game, the comics, novels, and he mentions video game here. He'll mention that again later. So all that stuff is sort of like fine, interesting. They get asked about the sort of canonicity of like the comics and the novels, and they say that Mike mentions they plan to try and keep everything canon, but some stuff may need to be tweaked. No details gone into there, but what I took from this, like, this was one of the weirdest reported on parts of the podcast, because some people took this as, oh, they don't view the other content as being canon, and people very much trying to frame it as like, I don't like this comic, so that means Mike and Bryan will decanonize this comic that I don't like, when I took almost the reverse of like, they're going to keep everything as much canon as possible, but they're not going to let a minor little detail get in their way, so minor things will happen, hence the word tweaked and not massively changed. The big one, probably one of the more significant things from the whole podcast, is that they do say here they will not be adapting the graphic novels or the novels into movies or TV shows. There's no plan right now. They do say like it could maybe happen in the future, but not right now, but that they are feeding off those stories at the moment. And that makes sense with obviously the rumor that the first one is going to be a Kyoshi movie, and the whole reason Kyoshi is so popular is because of those novels, and they would be silly to not use the continuity established from them. And I take it that that's what they're going to be doing. It'll probably be a very similar situation for the Zuko movie if that's confirmed, and so on. So this section here about sort of basically them talking about continuity and their plans. What were your thoughts on what they had to say here?
Yeah, I thought the idea of like decanonized things, I don't know. I feel like that's like a somewhat of a reach in the podcast in terms of like what they were saying, because it didn't really come across like that to me at all. I mean, I'm sure, if some things have to be, I don't know, altered a bit so that they fit within the story, they'll do what's necessary. But it didn't sound like they were like unhappy with any of the other, main media story content that has been written so far. So I don't know. It didn't seem, like they were going to, go the whole Star Wars thing and just, axe half of the stuff. They also said that they're not really big enough where they feel that that's like even needed. I mean, there's 2 shows, there's a bunch of comics, there's the books, and there's a couple other elements out there as well. But in comparison, it's not that huge of a universe. And like we've mentioned, and like you've said, they've pretty much put a pause on a lot of things so that they can do the movies without interfering with anything else that they want to tell. And the idea that they have a whole bigger picture involved, the whole phase 1, 2, 3, 4, however, whatever they're going to consider that for Avatar, it sounds like they have more of that stuff, actually structured at this point, which was the whole point of, coming back into things and taking everything over from the top down. So it definitely sounds like, planning wise, things are actually looking up in things. It's just, sort of when does stuff come out and, how long until that flows out from everything that they've been working on so far. So no, I thought that was a good, part of the cast in terms of like them saying, what they can at this time for what's going forward without, obviously giving anything away or confirming too much overall.
Mm-hmm. And your thoughts on the confirmation here of no adaptations, especially given that we kind of through leaked information know what the first 3 movies will be about, and most people speculating that they might be an adaptation of Rise of Kyoshi, The Search, Smoke and Shadow, Turf Wars, something like that. Them confirming directly no, but like that they'll, I suppose, use the setup from the comics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're, for everything that has worked, at least in terms of positive, it would make sense for them to like continue with those stories, especially if those movies that are, more or less rumored, confirmed, whatever, are dealing in those eras. Like it would be, like you said earlier, it would be odd not to use those. So I don't know, for me, it doesn't, I don't know. I know a lot of people, they really like those stories, myself as well. And, it would be cool to see them adapted, but, Mike and Bryan and, most creative artists are, always looking to try to do something new and to push things forward and, not tread over things that have been done, exactly before. Like, there's always the element of like, nothing's ever new, but you can still, take your own spin on it, which definitely seems what they're doing. And, it seems like they've always had that in mind with their content, that they always want to do something new after they've, recharged from whatever the previous big project that they've worked on. So I don't know. I think it's, a good idea from my perspective of them to sort of like push new things and not necessarily retread on old things. I mean, I'm sure, depending on, how they do the movies, maybe we'll get a flashback or 2 on something that happened in, the books or something like that. And I'm sure everyone will be super excited about that. But I think it's, worth it to keep things moving.
Yeah, like for the potential Zuko movie, like they're gonna say something about how Ursa's back. Like, it would be a little bit weird if they just jumped in and just, like, here she is, without saying anything. So I think we'll get, like, tiny little bits of adaptation like that, where they quickly recap some of the events of The Search to establish what's going on here. Say for the Kyoshi thing, like, I think there are definitely aspects that they'll have to bring you up to speed on about, like, maybe something about Dao Fei, Kyoshi's parents, maybe even just like the influence of someone like a Janju on her, those type of things. But there's a way to do it, because typically Avatar, at least the shows, have had like a recap thing as we jump in. So there's that. Final little bits and pieces. Brian, right at the end, does confirm a bunch of video games in the works. And this is interesting because the only other confirmation of Avatar video games, I think the only one that's officially confirmed is the Avatar Generations. Is that what the mobile game is called? I think that's what it's called. That's the only one that ever got officially confirmed. Everything else was just this sort of Avatar news, insider information about there being this game, that game, and the other. So Brian saying there's a bunch of video games here is actually kind of big information as far as I'm aware. Maybe I'm forgetting something, but that's a somewhat of a big drop ultimately. And then smaller projects are mentioned that they're doing them and that they are just excited about them. So I take that to sort of be, like he mentioned in like the animation section, of like none of the big projects will be in purely 3D. So I get the impression we will have shorts or something like that will use 3D animation and so on. They'll have different styles for different things. I think they actually said that in one of their previous interviews. So all that stuff I think feels perfectly fine. But your thoughts on those kind of final little bits of information?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all gotten the feeling that they're, would be odd for them not to do more games in some capacity. So the fact that he's, more or less saying that there are, potential things at least in the works, if they're not already been, well thought out, isn't too surprising, but it's nice to hear them actually say that, since that's something that many people want. And, people have been working on their own to make their own ones. So it's nice that we'll get like some official ones, and hopefully it'll be, more than just sort of the mobile segment of games as well. But that, those type of games definitely take a longer way to actually sort of produce, depending on the quality and everything with them, of course. But yeah, as long as, they're going forward with that, I think that definitely is something to look forward to. And then, yeah, I mean, they've mentioned before that I think from the beginning we've known that they're going to do, other projects and other different styles, other forms of media. So, the fact that those could be, fully CG or some hybrid like they do for their main ones, or, maybe just shorter, full 2D ones, I think could definitely work really well, as long as it fits into, the grand scheme of, how they're outlining things, which seems to be the main thing that they keep saying over and over again.
Mm-hmm. From there, we'll go into the news about what has been announced for San Diego Comic-Con, which is coming up next weekend. So we've kind of expected there to be something, and there are 2 panels, but it's definitely not what we were, I suppose, hoping for. So the first panel is on Friday, and that is Avatar Braving the Elements Live. So it's pretty much the standard Braving the Elements podcast description. They will have guests, but that's really about it. They're very general about it. Depending on what description you read, it doesn't even mention guests. One of them does, but it doesn't say who they are. If there was going to be news, I think they would have straight up announced Mike and Bryan as being on, so I don't really think there's going to be much from that one. But what are your thoughts on that? Another Braving the Elements live Comic-Con panel?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things, like we've mentioned before, it's cool if you're there, and, a couple, weeks or months or whenever, you'll be able to hear from your podcast app as well. So it's one of those event there cool things. Otherwise, not too much for it from our perspective.
Yeah, like we actually could be waiting quite a while, because I think it was like just a few days ago actually that they released on the feed the Comic-Con at Home podcast one that they did.
Yeah.
So that was like 9 months later or something like that. We'll get the information. People will live tweet these things, but I'm not expecting much from this one for sure. That podcast just doesn't feel like, at this point, it's a news podcast in any way, and in many ways feels like it's like scares news away almost, because when they interview Mike and Bryan, they are so aware that they probably can't ask certain questions because they're official, that they don't want to ask them the questions, and they're so like very much guide them away from that. And that was the difference between, say, the last Mike and Bryan interview, which was a non-event on the podcast, versus this one, which was more questions asked by fans, and they actually got some good answers. The second panel, there's a little bit more hope to this one, but it's again more of the same. So, water, earth, fire, air, continuing the Avatar legacy. This is on the Saturday. So it's Abrams Books, Dark Horse Comics, and Magpie Games are thrilled to treat fans to a panel worthy of the Avatar. FCE, Brendan Conway, who's the co-owner of Magpie Games, Janet Varney, and moderator Cara O'Neill, who works for Dark Horse, explore the past, present, and future of the beloved world. So it's the very general panel description in terms of like what the panel's actually going to be about. It is our publishing panel here, but now including Magpie Games. We have had some panels before, including Abrams, including FCE as well. So this is going to be, 3 days after the release of Dawn of Yang Chen. So I'm not really expecting there to be like too much focus on that, because they really don't like to spoil things ahead of time. And then I just kind of question, like, even with Magpie Games, they're like, are they going to talk about that much, as we'll get to, with what's going on with that. Janet Varney is there, of course. She's on so much stuff now, it's almost not exciting to see her listed here. And then Cara O'Neill, like, the Dark Horse inclusion here is probably the most interesting thing, because they don't really have anything to talk about, because they've had, in the grand scheme of things, like an awful year in terms of Avatar, and there's not that much interesting to talk about. So unless there's going to be some announcements here, and that maybe all the publishers together talk about what Avatar Studios means for them, because theoretically there are books to be announced. The second Yang Chen book, theoretically maybe, and then with the Dark Horse stuff, like, properly announced Beast of the Four Nations will be a nice thing, and just to say what you're doing next, because otherwise it's like delays is the entire focus. I personally don't expect much. I think this will be very similar to everything else, just with the new edition of Magpie being here as well. What are your thoughts on this publishing panel?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really, I don't know, these type of panels can either go, either way. Sometimes you do get new things, or sometimes you'll get like concept or, some information on the development of various different projects. But typically for ones like these, you don't really get anything, super newsworthy out of it. I mean, I think it's good that there is going to be another panel at the com that's, more dedicated directly to Avatar. But yeah, the publishing side of things can be sort of hit or miss, because I've been to some where they give you like a whole bunch of new stuff and concept art and stuff like that, and other ones where it's really just like a recap of what's already out, and maybe they'll give away the book or something like that because it just came out. So it'll definitely be, it might be fun if you're there and you're into a couple of those different properties and want to hear sort of their responses to questions and stuff like that. But in terms of like you're saying like newsworthy stuff, that can be hit or miss usually on these ones.
Yeah, like it has been a while since they've announced anything new at these panels. It's just sort of the hope that we're in an Avatar Studios sort of like leaning era, that they have to say something eventually, and that like if Mike and Bryan are saying that like, oh, we've sort of figured out what to do for our stuff and what to do for the comics publishing, we haven't really seen that come to fruition just yet, except with this kind of, I suppose, the Yang Chen book initially now, and otherwise, like, Dark Horse feel like they're nowhere and they need to say something. But we will see. We'll cover the news if any actually comes out, but it doesn't look great right now. And obviously that means like no mention of Avatar Studios anywhere there. It was always going to be like an early announcement if it was anything. The timing on some of this stuff does feel a bit weird, in that like we got that news of like everywhere posting about it. 3 movies confirmed. Lauren Montgomery's the director of the first one. Then we got that news that they showed a piece of concept art off to the press. Then Mike and Bryan do this interview where they're much more open about Avatar Studios. there was a sense that like they were building up to like, oh, we're going to make an announcement soon, and then perfect opportunity, place to do it, no. So unless they're waiting until New York Comic Con, it's probably looking like 2023 is going to be the year they properly announce Avatar Studios stuff, because they kind of have to, if it's going to be like 2024 for the first project, or anyway, like it's going to be way too long by the time we get to next year. Like you can't just have like 2 years with like no significant news after you made a big deal about announcing your new studio. So what are your thoughts on the lack of Avatar Studios here, and what it likely means for when we will get big news?
Yeah, I mean, from the little bit that we do know that they, mentioned from, earlier, I guess, what was that, like the other sort of event that they had, it did seem like it was very little, and I definitely could, understand the sort of vibe that it was sort of like building up to things, but the fact that they kept that one so secretive, like, they barely let anybody even talk about it, let alone like show things. It almost doesn't surprise me too much that we're not getting that much at, San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, I feel like they've been, reiterating, which isn't necessarily a good thing, that, it's still like early times in development in terms of, how things are going forward, and how, even the idea of the 3 movies is like pseudo officially confirmed. It feels, very odd, how things are going, despite, the most recent interviews saying that they do have things really planned out and stuff like that. But maybe it's really just planned and there's not a lot of implementation yet on it. I don't know. It's, from the outside in, it's hard to gauge how different things are going. But, the fact that there's no mention, at least as far as I've known, that of anything about Avatar Studios for San Diego Comic-Con, speaks a lot to where they really think that they're at this time, which, isn't necessarily a bad thing if they're, still chugging along and things are coming at like the pace that they're decided. So I don't know. I guess that's maybe somewhat expected, but, it's definitely a bit of a downer in terms of just, fans, wanting to see stuff. So I do wonder if that would lead things more to being at, New York Comic Con, but even that, it's only like a couple more months to New York Comic Con. So I don't know. I could see maybe them saying more things, but again, I think in the past we've discussed this, that a lot of the sort of TV media type of stuff almost always gets mentioned first time at San Diego Comic Con. So I mean, it does seem like a really long time for them to wait till next San Diego Comic Con to actually sort of make announcements of things. But I don't know, maybe that's what they're sort of planning for. Although, I don't know, with everything going now, I wouldn't be surprised if something did get, mentioned at least early next year, and then the big thing comes from San Diego Comic-Con next year, and then, everything sort of moves along if they go for like 2024 for the actual stuff to actually potentially be out and stuff like that. So I don't know, that's just me making up a timeline on the fly right now. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it does feel at the February investors event next year that they kind of have to say something, because it was weird that they just didn't mention it like at all at this year's event, and then in a way like shortly afterwards we're like, hey, we actually do have something to say. It was kind of weird. But the other thing, there was an interview with FCE, one of the only like proper like marketing things in a way for the Yang Chen book. So like from a marketing point of view, like there's been posts like getting closer to release, but there still hasn't been that much. So just that sense of like, the fans are all behind the books, but they're not really doing it themselves. So yeah, the interview with FCE, by the time it came out, like I think my copy arrived like I think the day after this interview hit. So the interview wasn't particularly significant to me because I had the book. But the main takeaway is that he confirms there is a second Yang Chen novel. We had never known that before. We thought it was likely, but it was never confirmed. So he says that. He even actually gives a little bit of like kind of plot details about it, which is mainly significant if you actually have read The Dawn of Yang Chen. And then right at the end, like the other piece of news is sort of that, again, sort of badly reported on piece of news, that he was asked something along the lines of, if he knows anything about Avatar Studios. And he just basically gives a non-answer saying that, like, no, I'm just a fan like anyone else. Like, the novel department is different than anything else. And this sort of took off as, like, big reports of, like, FCE not involved in Kyoshi movie, when, like, he was never asked about a movie. He was never asked about a Kyoshi movie. It was just, like, he gave a kind of PR response that, like, I'm not going to talk about Avatar Studios stuff. And then, even if he did have anything to say, I don't think he would have said anything in this interview about it anyway. So, that was a bit frustrating to see how that got reported on, and it became a big issue and debate. So, what are your thoughts on this? Finally, confirmation that I guess it's going to be another kind of duo here for these books. And then, what happened with that final question in the interview?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that it's going to be more, I think, is, really good. I think, it seems like that seems to be the strat that they're working for these stories. And, so far it seems to be pretty successful. So definitely seems like it's the right way to go about it. And yeah, I mean, the whole idea of, his direct involvement with the movies, I mean, just because he made, the books doesn't necessarily mean that he has to be like 100% involved in the movies, or that he's going to be like the writer on that. Like, he writes novels, not necessarily movies. So I'm sure if they need to, they'll reach out to him, since as we mentioned earlier, everything seems to be coming down from Mike and Bryan. So if they do need anything from him, I'm sure they'll be in touch. But it just doesn't mean that he's directly involved with it. Even if he could say it, like you were saying, like that's not something that he would probably be allowed to say in any regard. Anyway, so I don't know. It seems like something that might have just got blown out of proportions.
Yeah, like I agree. It's silly to expect like FCE to be announced as the writer for the movie when he writes novels. I would be surprised if by the time the movie comes out, FCE confirms that he had like absolutely no involvement in this. I'd be shocked if they didn't have him look over their script or just give some piece of advice or something like that to just assist with this. If it's going to be based mostly off continuity he helped to make, I can't see why they wouldn't. On the other side, if he full on isn't involved, well, Mike's involved, and Mike helped with the novels, and I get it, he didn't directly write the books, but there is still a sense of like, he's the one fundamentally like approving a lot of the stuff that comes out, and because of that they're aware of what is in those books. Plus, they wrote Kyoshi before the Kyoshi novels, and I get it again, the books are like most of what Kyoshi is, but the core of her character was still there. There's a reason she was popular. Those books, people even read them in the first place, is because people liked the character from the characterization that came from Mike and Bryan and other writers. I get the attachment because FCE has been very important in the fan base for the last couple of years, but we don't need to go overboard with it when he's still here writing books. We'll see what happens to see how connected everything is. It's still very early for anyone to be confirming involvements when, like we said, the Kyoshi movie thing is still not official information. It spread around, and I think most people think it's true, but it's not officially confirmed yet. So that's that, and that brings us mostly into, I think, merchandise news from here. So McFarlane announced a new wave of figures. So we've been waiting for this. It's been actually super slow with McFarlane this year. We haven't really had a lot, and they confirmed a new lineup. And the unfortunate thing about this is that it's a pretty boring lineup of figures. So in terms of the smaller scale figures, we get a 2-pack featuring a alternate version of Avatar State Aang and Blue Spirit Zuko. We get another creature kind of size class figure. This time it is the Komodo Rhino. In the bigger scale figures, the 7-inch line, we get another Book 1 Zuko, another Book 1 Aang, and then one new character, and that is like book one Sokka. So they slowly revealed these over time, and it's like, I like the McFarlane figures, but I really do not like the release cadence, both in terms of how long it's taking and their character and design choices. My big problem with this is that this Aang and this Zuko is so much better than the initial one for the first wave, in that it feels like they purposely did weird faces so they could sell you normal faces in the second wave. Because the accessories look like they're fairly similar. Aang has Momo this time instead of the glider. Zuko otherwise I think is mostly the same. The Sokka actually looks quite good, but there was a bit of a controversy about how the initial pictures looked. I think it's mostly settled down now that there's been more pictures out, but they chose some bad pictures initially to show off the Sokka. I like the Komodo Rhino, but I'm a bit confused as to why there's no like standard Fire Nation soldier character to ride on top of him. Because it's an unfortunate thing about those figures where like that means Zuko is the only figure that's really like correct to put on it. But Zuko's probably one of the least posable figures, so he can't really sit down properly on the Rhino. So there's a few weird kind of things there, and just such a lack of variety. Like, still no female character in the 7-inch scale, and no new character as such in the smaller scale, because it's just Aang and Zuko again. Even though I guess Blue Spirit Zuko is a kind of significant kind of redo of the character. What are your thoughts on this lineup here, the sort of, I suppose, second half of the year lineup for McFarlane?
No, it's definitely, along the odder lines of things. Because, I mean, I think, for the most part, I think they look good. Like, the detailing that they have on the outfits is good. Like, the detailing that they have on the rhinos, interesting. Even Sokka, now that we have, other perspective of his, face and stuff, I think looks pretty good. I mean, yeah, there's always, like, some things that could be tweaked to make them more, screen accurate if you want to go that route. But, I think overall they are really good. And I think that, people who have been wanting these figures to be more, or thought that these figures would be on the sort of higher end of things, are definitely, that's definitely something that's worth here. But like you said, in terms of like these coming out, how long it's taken them to push them out, I don't know. It feels like, comparatively to the other ones, it feels like it's a lot slower. Maybe that's, a quality-wise thing, and why theirs is so much better than the other ones. But the idea that, they are sort of a rehash of the previous years to some degree, I don't know. It does feel a bit odd. I don't know, maybe just because, they feel that these are the only ones that will sell. I mean, maybe that's their whole sort of marketing thing with these, and that's how they see getting the return on these. I don't know. It feels like the other ones have been doing well for the other characters, so I don't see too much of the danger in branching out, but maybe they're privy to something that we're not aware of. And I don't know, the whole thing with the Komodo Rhino, I mean, it looks cool. Like, the detailing looks cool. Like, when you see it in the pictures, I mean, maybe it's just the pictures, but it definitely looks really interesting. But for some reason, that doesn't stand out to me as something that I would particularly want, or that people are, like, really wanting. Like, maybe if it had, like, one of the rough rhino dudes on top of it, it would be more interesting. Or, like you said, if at least it had, like, a default generic Fire Nation soldier on it, which I know that'll, increase the cost and everything like that. But I don't know. Out of all the creatures in the Avatar world, I mean, yeah, they're in the beginning of the show, but, like, I don't think they have that much of a draw in comparison to the other animals. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Yeah, like, it's weird because they're clearly going in order. Everything is book one. Everything's been book one except Toph so far. Which makes her kind of stand out as, like, weird that they've done her already, but everything else is book one. So yeah, it makes sense that, yeah, Appa, first main notable animal, and then Komodo Rhino, the other one that you're going to do, because a lot of the other animals are either, like, really small or kind of too big, or they only, like, appear once or something like that you're probably not going to do them. But to have more of a draw, like, you probably should be doing, like, a dragon or a badger mole before this. Now, it's pretty obvious that, like, say, when they finally announced the chorus stuff, they're going to do a Naga at this scale, and it's going to, I think, look really good. Like you said, I like it. It looks good. I think partially why they're doing this is probably because they did a Komodo Rhino figure for the original toy line. So they're probably just kind of like, we got to do our one of them as well. But that old toy line at least had a Fire Nation soldier figure that you could put on it. This one is a little kind of weird. Because it's weird, because I think the Rhino's the standout figure of the wave, but it's also like the most like obscure. Because otherwise it's like the bigger Sokka is probably the most interesting one. So I'm not really sure what the deal is. But there's an interesting kind of thing with this, in that like they say the tail is bendable because it has like a wire insert in it. So that's kind of interesting. So they're trying to do what they can, because otherwise they're not really like articulated as such. Like the Wave 1 Appa was probably the best piece of merchandise that came out that year. Not super articulated, but the sculpt was amazing. So I'm very excited for more of these creatures, because they're unique at least. It's not just that like every action figure line is doing the same things. Only McFarlane is doing animal figures so far, apart from like the odd Momo that you'd see. So I do appreciate this, but it does feel like they need to almost like just consult a fan about like, what figures do you want? Because no one is going to want this many Aangs. Like, you just look through this is now sort of, I guess, the third wave of figures that they've put out, in terms of just batches of releases, and the amount of Aangs that they have is like insane, and there's so little variety across the lines. But there is just the hope that because they've done Katara and Toph in the other line, that we'll get them in this one. But we're years away from like a Ty Lee, a May. That's for me the big test of a lot of these manufacturers, is like, once you do your initial characters, are you going to give us the kind of key supporting cast members that have never got an action figure before? That's what I'm kind of counting down towards, because like it just feels weird that like nearly 20 years on, we're still seeing the new companies do their book 1 Aang and expecting people to be excited about it is a bit not great. And I will say, like, I think all the manufacturers this year have been extremely slow with their releases, because we're still waiting for, like, say, the Loyal Subjects to release their Wave 2, even though it was announced, like, I think in around this time last year. Diamond Select are just in a situation where I'm pretty sure they've given up on the figures in terms of action figures, but they're continuing with the statues, but we don't know what's next. We're still waiting on that. So maybe around Comic-Con we'll get some more merchandise news, because it has been oddly slow, especially when in the Korra anniversary year we've got basically no Korra merch. We're still waiting for that pop-up Ray Korra to get announced, and we're just in a weird situation. But I don't know, have you noticed that with the merchandise, that like, even though we've talked about it somewhat regularly over the year, that we haven't actually talked about too much of it actually like being released, or that much variety in it?
Yeah, no, I think the variety thing is very apparent when you start looking at things. I mean, it definitely feels like, we've mentioned before, like every time a new company jumps into, getting the licensing for Avatar, they start over again. So like, everything starts from square one, and they have to build themselves back up. And, like you said, some of them seem to have like sort of abandoned it, which is, interesting. Maybe they just don't see the return on it, which, is totally a thing. And that's not, surprising that happens sometimes. But I don't know, maybe their strategy for this, or, the popularity of, the initial sort of hype has just sort of worn down on things, and they really do need to just sort of wait and take a step back in order to sort of start, releasing things when it's really meaningful. Like, I hope it doesn't become like, what happened last time, where they pushed out too much too early and the show wasn't enough, and then everything just sort of fell apart, because that almost feels like maybe that's what's happening. Just that we know from everything that we discussed earlier that there are movies and shows and stuff coming out. So I don't know, maybe this is another bad timing type of thing.
Yeah, because like as someone who like is a reasonably big collector like within the fandom, like it's even like adversely affecting like my interest in the stuff that like I like to try at least like one of a new thing in the line. So I end up like with this situation where I'm like I have like book one Aang of like nearly everything, and I don't want a new book one Aang even if the new like company that I'm actually interested in kind of comes out with something. Um, that's I think the main problem, and it just waiting for that company to just come out and like do something a little bit different and be like, do you know what? We're gonna start off with like Mei, Tai Li, and like Aang, something like that. Like you'll get your main characters, but you know you'll finish the main cast by wave five, of which will also have all these other characters done. Rather than like, hey, I have the book one Aang like Funko Pop, and for this line, and for this line, and for this line, and this thing. It's just, someone do something different. At least Diamond Select started off with book three characters for the most part. I still think it's weird that there's no book three Katara stuff outside of like a statue or two. A lot of weirdness going on there. But moving on, we do have some other stuff. Dark Horse Direct have another expensive statue. So this is to go alongside the Korra, the book 4 Korra that they announced. This is book 3 Aang, Dark Horse Direct, another $200 figure. Again, because it's through Direct, you have to order it directly from their website. It's limited. I like this one. I actually really like the look of this one. But again, I don't think it looks so good that it justifies the $200 price, especially when they don't ship to Ireland. And so you're kind of like, you've already sort of priced me out, but now I couldn't even get it if I wanted to necessarily. Well, easily I couldn't get it if I wanted to. So I'm very confused about what Dark Horse is doing. That you announce a reasonably priced, nice looking statue line with a cool Zuko and Katara. And then you follow that up by being like, here's Korra, who everyone's been asking for, and an Aang in this other deluxe line that's like super, super expensive. And all the while it's like, what's going on here? Are these full-on lines? Are there going to be more of the cheaper ones? Are they going to be more of the more expensive ones? I don't know what they're doing, is I think part of the problem here. And especially when it seems like Korra is being kept behind like quite a heavy like paywall here with like not a lot of cheap merchandise for Korra. I'm left feeling pretty confused about what they're doing. But what are your thoughts on the new big Aang statue here?
Yeah, I mean, it looks cool. I really like the look and the style of it. I think, the pose that they picked for it is dynamic. And when they, pair it up with the backdrop from the actual, episode that it's in, I think, that looks great. In terms of like, getting it and its appeal to people, I mean, I'm sure, to some people it'll definitely be high on their list if you're into the more sort of statue, more high quality type of figures. Is it worth the 200 that they currently have it listed for? I'm not sure about that. I mean, it is Dark Horse Direct, so their stuff, tends to be higher since it does come from them. And they're the ones that are producing and shipping and doing all that stuff. So they always have like restrictions on how they're doing things compared to where it's in like, sort of like a normal retailer at all like that. But so I guess if you really want this, you're really going to have to go for it and, expect it in terms of the quality of this. But yeah, in terms of like their overall plan for things, I don't know. I mean, it feels like the stuff from Dark Horse is just sort of like they're making whatever they can sort of like, get an artist set up or whatever company sort of wants to make something interesting and they can make, their limited run of things and just sort of push it out there. But beyond that, it doesn't feel like there's, a whole lot of like huge line of like, oh, we're going to do these and then these are going to be the next set and so forth and so forth. It's just like when we get a cool one that we can produce, we're going to put it out there and charge what they feel at least is accordingly for the price.
Yeah, because at least for me, I would have been like straight away, like if the Korra and the Aang were in the same line as the Zuko and the Katara, I would have been like straight away, yeah, I'm going to pre-order that. But just for some reason. Because I think the thing with the really expensive ones is that the poses don't seem like so complicated that they have to be that price. And like I get it, it's part of it's the material, part of it's the fact that it is a direct thing, but I think for a lot of people the material doesn't matter like that much, and especially when they can do nicely detailed statues using the cheaper material and it looked just as good. You need to do more than that, I think, to sell me on some of these things. But we'll move on from that. New Avatar Funko Pop just was announced and released. A new Katara Funko Pop. The fandom has had a little bit of a challenge figuring out what this one is maybe meant to like depict, because it's basically book one Katara with her hair down doing like a little waterbending pose. So it's a very specific look here for this one. I think it's like a Funko themselves exclusive. It's metallic, I think, as well. Glow in the dark, I think. I'm confused about if there's multiple versions of it or if it's just the same one. Because like it's an exclusive to different places in different countries. But either way, it's out now. What are your thoughts on this one, and what do you think this one is meant to like be depicting from what's seen?
Yeah, that's a good question there. I mean, the pose itself is cool. It looks dynamic. It definitely feels like it's, from a point when she's more experienced in her bending rather than, earlier on where she's just sort of like flailing around and things. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It definitely feels like the pose-wise it would be something from like book 3 or something like that, just because of, the amount of control that, at least they're depicting in the figure at least. But yeah, the whole hairstyle with, the loopies, well, unkept loopies, I guess, definitely makes it feel like it's earlier on or something like that. So I don't know. It's an odd one for sure. I think it doesn't look bad per se. I think it's it probably only really matters to people like us who are like trying to place it in the series where it comes from. Everyone else will just be like it's sort of a cool one, and the fact that it says glow in the dark, which I'm assuming is the sort of water effect, as to sort of like mystique and intrigue that for people who really want to get it. I do wonder if there are other versions of it, but the way that they do Funko Pops and the different variation, like I think it still escapes me to some degree because there's so many different options that they have now, and how people are collecting them. But definitely looks cool. I think if you're into Funko Pops, and especially since it's not super expensive, at least from the listing that I'm seeing, it definitely might be worth it if you can of course find it.
Mm-hmm. I looked around in the series for stuff like this, and from what I can tell, I think what this is meant to be, and it's not completely accurate, I think this is meant to be Katara from her fight against Paku in 118. The problem is, when her hair comes down is when like the fight is over. Like Katara never fights back when her hair comes down, because in this instance she's kind of knocked aside. Her necklace comes off, her hair comes down, and then Paku finishes the fight. So it's one of these kind of scenes where, like, I think that's the only time Katara is in her book 1 outfit, which this clearly is, has her hair down, but the pop obviously depicts her doing an attack and she still has the necklace on. So it's slightly inaccurate. I get what they're trying to go for, but this should have just been, I think, book 3 Katara. Like, do this exact pose, just change the outfit to be book 3, and I think this is like a perfect pop. It's one of those ones where, like, I have most of the Avatar Funko Pops. I don't get every single individual version. I think I have most of like the molds. So I'll get this one when I think there's like a supersonic pop that I want to get that's coming out shortly. So I'll maybe put this in with the order, but it's a weird one that they went very specific, but it's inaccurate to, I think, the specific moment that they're going for here. Because it's confusing, because a lot of people, when I posted the news about this, were also kind of being like, oh, is it from book 2? But then you realize, no, Katara has a very different outfit in book 1 compared to book 2. Like, she still has the full long sleeves here. She doesn't have that in book 2 and so on. And then her book 3 outfit is of course, very different again. So, not sure. Hopefully this means that we're not too far away from the new wave coming out that's been rumored for quite a while. That's meant to have, like, the painted lady in it, a big boy in the iceberg, Ang Pop and stuff like that. That I think it was said that it was meant to have, like, variants of some of the other characters as well, like a Katara variant, Sokka variant, Toph variant. So hopefully this is the start of that stuff beginning to come out. I don't think I've heard any additional rumors on it, but hopefully soon. Last piece of news is... Oh, second last piece of news, actually. Patterns in Time has been delayed again. I think this is like the 8th or 9th delay, but I probably have lost count. It's now coming out November 22nd this year. So this time it didn't get a full month delay. Instead, it just got 2 weeks delay. So maybe it's finally settling down, but still, it's getting awfully close to dropping out of the year, and there's nothing really to suggest that this is going to be the last delay for this book. I still remain confused as to why this keeps on getting pushed back and what's going on with it, because it's just these anthology books just seem major problems with them. We've mentioned this every single time, but like, what are your thoughts on what's going on with this? Do you think it will finally settle on a date?
I don't know. I mean, at this point, it's like who really knows what they're sort of going for with this story. It definitely seems like they're not considering anything else that's going on and things. It's just like something with its own production or whatever that's just pushing it back for whatever reason. So I have no ideas at this point.
Yeah, I hope at the panel someone asks Dark Horse about what's going on with their release dates, because it's comical at this point, because it feels like they can't just use like kind of COVID shipping stuff as an excuse for it, because it's like so extreme that like so many other books like can keep their dates. Like there are other Avatar books that aren't getting anywhere near as heavily delayed, like the book 4 art book reprint is out in like I think 2 weeks, and over the course of it being announced, I think it's only been pushed back by 2 weeks in total, which is fine and makes sense because of like shipping issues and so on. But why this specifically? Why is it the new content specifically that's getting like thrown around the place? Especially new content that like we pretty much know has been done for a very long time, as evidenced by the fact that the Chibi book is start of next year still. So we'll see what happens if they say anything or not. Final piece of news then. Kickstarter update for July. So this is the Avatar Legends role-playing game Kickstarter. There's a few little things here. So they talk about how they just recently filmed the all-star play here. They got Jenny Kwan, voice actors for Suki. They got Dante Bosco and some other people to play the game, and they recorded it, and they're going to release that to people who have backed it. Probably the more significant thing to us is that the story that the adventure that they played is called An Urgent Request, and they will be releasing a PDF for backers for this. The description of that says, the renowned air nomad Ryoshan has uncovered a plot to discredit Princess Zaysan and her air nomad teachings. However, the nun and the princess have a past, and Ryoshan can't just go to Zaysan and tell her about the plot. Instead, she enlists the help of heroes to warn the princess and foil whatever nefarious plot their enemies have planned. So this is more Roku-related lore, because obviously Princess Zaysan is Sozan's sister. This is kind of significant. I'm wondering when we get this, will it have more actual information here? Because she was definitely the highlight from the RPG book, so it looks like we're maybe getting a little bit more there. But yeah, did you have any thoughts on this, the all-star kind of play here and that adventure they're doing?
I mean, the adventure sounds cool. If we do get more information out of it, I think that's definitely worth it. Whether it'll be like, something that's 100%, in canon, or just, general ideas that help towards, the sort of user-generated story that you develop from playing the game. I guess we'll find out when that sort of is fully sort of released and everything like that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it's a fun thing. It's definitely a nice, sort of addition to, what they're producing here. And I know they've been like sort of touting a lot, and, they got good people in it. So it should be interesting to see, especially since I know that, for a lot of people that is like a big thing. But I know, a lot of people still want to get their hands on the materials themselves as well.
Yeah, and that's the next part of the update, printing updates on play materials. So we're delighted to announce printing has begun. Proofing stage is complete, and our printer is beginning the enormous task of printing all these amazing books. We've mentioned previously this will take several months, and that still holds true. This is simply due to the sheer volume of books we're printing. As our printer progresses through the order, they'll let us know a shipping estimate, which we'll share with you. Play materials are available. You can update your address. That's going to be like the final update that they'll send out whenever this stuff happens, and they're going to be at Gen Con. The main thing here is, like, I get that it's like a challenging thing, but I do view this as definitely like 3 months and they still can't give us an update is a bit frustrating to me. That they seem like they're getting away with just like saying the absolute bare minimum when it comes to this stuff, and not even attempting to just be like, this is how long it will take. It's like still referencing that, oh yeah, it'll take several months, but then you have to remember, like, they're now printing in China, so they have to get it shipped from China to America, and then organize everything and send it out to backers, and then if you're an international backer, it's going to take even longer. So even at the like fairest estimate, it feels like people in America probably have a chance to get this stuff before the end of the year, but that's assuming everything goes perfectly. So I don't know. It's frustrating because they've refused effectively to give an update since like months and months ago. Like, it was initially February when stuff was meant to come out. Then it was summer, and now we're here in summer, and only now the printing has started. It's frustrating. I get there are problems, but it's not looking great. Like, things are definitely beginning to unravel a little bit with this. But what are your thoughts on the printing update?
Yeah, I mean, it's been unraveling for a bit of a while now, and I think maybe now seems like they might be getting on track, which is still like a late track, but at least, there's some progress being made towards that. So I don't know. I mean, realistically, in terms of getting them, I mean, I would be surprised if there was anything this year. I mean, it definitely doesn't feel like, they're going to be like, pushing extra fast or anything like that, which they probably shouldn't. Like, they should probably, take their time as much as they can so that, things come the right way and they're, produced to the quality that they need them to be. But, yeah, the overall process and experience just, hasn't been the best by far from, what most people have been saying about the whole campaign. But I guess that's also part of like, just the idea of doing Kickstarters in general is that like they can sometimes not turn out the best, but at least this one is still going and hasn't completely like dropped dead or anything like that.
Yeah, like it doesn't seem like things have gone as badly as some of their previous ones in terms of stuff going completely out of track, but it started to go that way, and like if there's another delay, I think that's going to lose a lot of people going forward. In that, I think there are already quite a few people who are like, I don't think I'll be doing any more of their Kickstarters just because of the way things have gone so far. I'm not quite there yet because I still ultimately will want to get the additional books, whatever way they're going to be releasing the Republic City ones and the Spirit World one. But I think that's going to depend on like if there is the same like lore section on those books as the other ones. But if they confirm that, like I'll probably will still be in. But we wait and see what they have to say. It does put them in a weird situation though with that Comic-Con panel, given that in the grand scheme of things they don't really have like a positive update going into that panel. And otherwise the material has actually been out for quite a while, so I wonder what they're going to be talking about there. I'm assuming it would probably the most effective thing if they like announced like here's how people who didn't back the project will be able to get the books, like announce when it will go up for sale digitally, because if they're starting printing, that means they have the final like file for the book, so they can actually start to, I suppose, sell it otherwise. And I know there's a few people who missed out on the Kickstarter and are wondering where people are getting all this information from. So that's been needed, I think, for quite a while. But I don't really know how that works in terms of like, can they only start to sell it to other people once they ship it to us or whatever? I don't really know. What are your thoughts on that? Like, when will they get around to announcing how other people can buy this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be really cool if they did announce that at the panel that they're part of, or, what would they be announcing? I mean, I'm sure they'll have like, some versions of it on hand to like show off and stuff like that. I don't, maybe that might be one of the giveaways that they do at the panel, because I know that is sometimes something that they'll do at the panels. They'll give away some of the physical media or the extras that they have on hand. But yeah, in terms of like releasing like the digital versions, I'm not sure about that either as well. I mean, I know you can get everything through sort of the RPG, role playing site that they currently have people going through. But in terms of like purchasing it directly, I wonder how their license for that all works, or how that actually is going to be like distributed and whatnot, and how the copyright works with all of that. And I don't know. That's an interesting idea in terms of how they're going to be releasing that, or if they even are going to be releasing like that, or will they, whenever they do get to actually producing the stuff, will they have another round where you can like actually like buy these in like your typical store places, or at least online directly from them, if that's even a thing that they could do.
Yeah, like I believe they've already said that like it will be available for purchase like eventually, but there are no details like right now. I think that was like the whole point of one of the backing tiers was for like shops to like buy it, and you get like, what was it, like 6 copies of the book, and you get some of the extras to give away as well. And it's just when exactly the timing on that can work, I'm not really sure. But yeah, that's been all of the news. And then of course, just for everyone to be aware, Dawn of Yang Chen is out in 3 days, July 19th. So be aware of that. The book is out. There's a Barnes and Noble's exclusive version if you want some more art extras. And from what I hear, it has another like deleted chapter from The Shadow of Kyoshi. I thought the description for the book said it was a deleted scene from the Dawn of Yang Chen, but obviously not. So we'll see what happens with that. But we will, be reviewing Dawn of Yang Chen in upcoming podcasts. But we'll move into our episode reviews for this podcast, and we're going to start off with 111: The Great Divide. So everyone's favorite episode of Avatar here. Every time I watch this episode, I always think like, is this going to be the time I really see why everyone like dislikes it so much? And I never actually see that. I'm not going to say that this is one of the greatest episodes of Avatar, but I think people do over-exaggerate how bad it is, and that it's not even my least favorite episode of Avatar. This is very watchable, and in many ways is like more interesting than some of the episodes we've done already in reviews. It just, at least for me, I think my general thoughts on this are that part of the reason that this episode feels forgettable is because the writers, in a way, chose to accept this as one of the lower quality episodes and never returned to it again. That's only ever referenced as a joke, when I would have loved to have seen the 2 tribe leaders show up again. I would have loved to have seen a follow-up episode that actually goes into what was the actual history of the 2 tribes about. Especially now, when one of the most interesting like characters, villains in all of Avatar, Jeonju, is a Ganjin tribe person. I'm confused why they saw all of this kind of interesting concepts and lore in this episode and just threw it aside. It's a bit of a weird one, because it's not necessarily even like a filler episode in the sense of like, this was part of their initial like 13 episode run before they even knew they'd be confirmed for like the rest of the series. So They chose to have this episode here for a reason. Like, I get it, they, in production wise, I don't think necessarily were the happiest about the whole 20 episodes per season thing. They would have preferred to do 13, but this is here at episode 11 for like a reason. So interesting stuff. But yeah, overall, like I said, I find this one interesting, and more it gets diminished because of how they treat it more so than anything. But what are your thoughts on the Great Divide overall?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely has sort of like been thrown to the wayside just because like it feels like maybe it's just sort of like a default scapegoat episode just to be one, not necessarily because it's like, has like the worst offending like character plot or characterizations or characters are acting really weird. Like for like an early episode with, the bit that we do know about our characters, like everything seems to sort of fall in line. Like Qatar is sort of like being sort of prim and proper side of things, and Sokka's being a little bit of a slob, and Aang's figuring out how to be neutral and be the Avatar. So I don't know, it does, I can definitely see why it's not people's favorite, and in the grand scheme of things it doesn't have like a huge like play in the factor of like world events or anything like that, even though it is kind of important just to show the state of the world, because that's like the first thing that Qatar yells out is like, oh, you're refugees and stuff like that. So it's like more just bringing awareness of the current state of the world and the Avatar world at that point in time. So definitely has its points there, but I guess just because it's sort of like an odd man out in terms of things, and maybe that's because, like you said, just the fact that they didn't bring it back in any sort of capacity, or they didn't like really mention it in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I mean, the fact that it's been referenced in the novels that has built upon it, makes it seems like and it's not like you can go back and sort of have that sort of foresight, but it definitely has a lot more to it now than you would have ever potentially thought it had.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's get into this one. I suppose we have to jump in with, I suppose, just the location itself. This seems to be the thing that they sort of, in a way, like poke the most fun at. In that, like, even I think when they first mention it, Katara's like, oh, look, it's the Great Divide. And then Sokka's like, yeah, I saw it anyway. So they're already, like, joking about it just by being here. I think it's notable. Like, book one is like a traveling show, basically. So we're all about stopping in a location, moving through it on our way up north. We spend a lot of time in episodes that aren't particularly plot focused, so I don't have too much of a problem with us spending time on the biggest canyon in the Earth Kingdom, and it is a massive canyon. And I think they do a decent job adding some world building to it. The Canyon Guide gives this sort of lore about it that, like, the legends say that the earth spirits formed it, and that they were angry at local farmers for not giving the right sacrifices, and so carved the chunks out of the landscape. Now, do you actually read into that? Is that being true, or is that just what people have made up to explain just the natural formation of the canyon? Who knows? But I like that they attempt to do something with it. Sure, it ends up just being a kind of rocky passageway, but I think the canyon crawlers being the sort of like animals kind of native to the canyon creates a bit of a nice dynamic about it, in that I'm waiting for the Great Divide to show up in another piece of media and like the canyon crawlers be here, because they're a surprisingly threatening and like crazy looking animal that really is kind of memorable to me. But what are your thoughts on the location itself and kind of what they do with it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I don't know, the location is interesting. It has a reason to be there. They have a lore to it, like you said. I mean, I think, their perspectives on it is sort of like, referenced on it, and that feels like something like people would say about like the Grand Canyon in America, and the same ideas, like some people think it's amazing that it's like a huge natural form, and then other people just like sort of like whatever to it. And, it's probably one of those things that you more or less have to be like there to experience. But, in terms of, how they're using it in the story, it has, an important plot point. It has, a reason for them to cross it. The guide there's, he's pretty knowledgeable. He's interesting. He has sort of like his sort of wise, sort of old man sort of character moments there as well as he does kind of go off the deep end as well. So I can see why, for some people that might not quite work as well for them. But, the idea of this being like a huge area that, comes along their travels, it feels like something that would happen in like a traveling show. And, either it's important or it's not important, but it's just something there to make note of as they continue on towards their final goal.
Mm-hmm. The main part of this episode, the main gimmick of the episode, is obviously the introduction of these two Earth Kingdom tribes, the Ganjin tribe and the Zhang tribe, which straight away is an interesting concept. I don't think we get this pretty much anywhere else, the idea of like an Earth Kingdom tribe. Now, straight away, they do a thing where, like, obviously they're both refugees. They say that where they come from has been destroyed by the Fire Nation. Now, we never really get a sense for like the location of each of these tribes. Through the backstories, you get the sense that, okay, the two tribes have always been connected in some way, in that there's a east gate into where one tribe is from, a west gate into the other one, and there's like a path between the two of them, which is an interesting concept. We never just clarify a location for one tribe or the other. But, from some of the information, we find that like obviously in the past, in Kyoshi's era, there was an Earth Sage from the Ganjin tribe, and that was Jeonju. And there was a Zhang Earth Sage also mentioned, who was one of the guys who gets killed in like the big poisoning attack. And it's kind of noted that incident takes out a lot of the power of the area. So Jeonju is responsible for there maybe not being in a strong position going into this era, but still, like, interesting stuff straight away. And sure, the kind of characterization of them is, just as opposites, prim and proper, and then like more sort of like practical and sort of like dirty almost, or something like that. And they obviously connect Katara to the Ganjins, Sokka to the Zhangs. And in that sense, it's like written somewhat well, with that idea of like, which tribe is correct, being sort of like over prepared versus doing the bare minimum, and then, more silly arguments about like the Zhangs trying to make the valid argument that you wouldn't have so many old people if you weren't so clean, is like a bit of a weird point to make. But I think they stand out as being somewhat interesting. That Avatar occasionally, goes in depth on a culture. You feel like you come out of this episode kind of knowing these two tribes at least a little bit. But what are your thoughts on them as the main thing in this episode?
I agree. You definitely do get a sense of their history through, the stories that they tell. Even, if the stories are from their own perspective, you understand that they have a place in this world, and they've been displaced, which is the whole reason for the travel here. So I don't know, I think there's a bit of a history in here, there's a bit of lore. I think it probably doesn't stand out overall in terms of things because it doesn't connect directly to Ba Sing Se or any of the other Earth Kingdom locations. So it feels like unfortunately it feels a bit sort of isolated in that sense, just because there's no overarching sort of like connecting element, at least not from the original series. Now we know that there is more connecting to them with the larger Earth Kingdom and Earth nation overall. But I don't know, I think their characterizations, while sort of like, I guess, hyper focused just for the sake of the episode, like it shows you just sort of the extremes of their ideas, and it gives a reason why Aang as a character can't just be one side or the other, which is sort of like the main idea of this episode, and just forcing his sort of like growth as a character along as well.
Mm-hmm. I suppose we'll go into the kind of history of the two tribes, at least the incident that causes them to feud, and Sokka learns from one tribe what they think the story is. Katara, the other. Aang obviously lies to resolve this in the end, and you're left wondering, what was it even about in the first place? So the details here are actually somewhat interesting if you treat it like seriously. So the Ganjin version of the story is that Jin Wei, their kind of tribe's founder, is an earthbender warrior, which is interesting in that none of either tribe are said to be a bender, because of course the whole point of this episode is that the only earthbender around is the Canyon Guide. So Jin Wei was an earthbender. He's delivering this sacred orb from the eastern gate to the western gate, which from context from the story seems to be delivering it from the Ganjin tribe's home to the Zhang's home. It's about the sun rising and setting. It's this redemption ritual, which is an interesting word to use. And then apparently Jin Wei is attacked by Wei Jin. The orb is stolen, and that's why the Ganjins hate the Zhangs. The Zhangs version of the story is that Wei Jin left the Western Gate, saw a struggling and injured Jin Wei, wanted to help him, but Jin Wei wanted the orb delivered back to his people more than help himself. Wei Jin did this, but was arrested, accused of stealing the orb, and put in prison for 20 years, and that's why they hate the Ganjins. So, interesting. Now, obviously, Aang is able to be like, hey, I was around 100 years ago, and it was just a game, and it was just a ball, and they were 8 years old, and they were twins. And obviously, he manages to convince them enough that this is the case. So, obviously, they didn't know their history so well that they can't counter what Aang says, but still, I've always found it interesting, is there any significance to this? This ritual where you have to run from one gate to another, a special orb, and fundamentally the idea that both tribes were connected in some way, even in the past, is an interesting concept. They obviously portray it kind of well in that there's a different art style for one flashback that sort of matches the the approach of each tribe. But what are your thoughts on the whole backstory stuff surrounding the incident? Do you kind of read into any of it as being sort of somewhat important in some way?
It's a good question. I mean, it definitely seems like it's important to them. I think the fact that they don't have a clear, understanding of their own history sort of minimizes its overall importance, which is probably why people don't really take as much stock into it, especially how Aang does the eventual resolution by just sort of making up an idea. But it seems like maybe it's just something that's gone on for so long that at this point neither or really knows what the real issue is, and they're willing enough to sort of let it go once they can see that the other side isn't potentially as bad as they thought, and they can come to some sort of pseudo resolution. I mean, I do wonder if we would have ever saw them in the future, would they have been sort of one tribe that figured out how to meet in the middle, as the term typically goes for these sort of things, or maybe they split back up again. I don't know in terms of that, but it definitely it feels like if, what we've learned from Kyoshi, that, these two tribes were sort of really important to, the nation at one point in time, that there probably is something more to the history here that we're just, not quite privy to, because of course it would be, probably before Aang's time as well. So, granted, he made up this whole story here, but there's probably something deeper to it that we don't really know about, which that might be something that would be interesting to explore if, something like the Kyoshi movies or something else along those lines would ever sort of referencing more detail the actual history of these two tribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's what's interesting about it. They mentioned 100 years ago here when this happened, but that's just Aang before the ice. That's after Roku's time. It's well after Kyoshi's time. So us meeting a Ganjin person back in the Kyoshi novels is hundreds of years before this event happened, which obviously I think Jeonju in that book does note animosity to the Zhang character, the Earth Sage. So it highlights that there's always been somewhat of a feud between the two tribes, even before this, historical incident that is actually the cause of it. So
Yes.
it makes me wonder if, like, this is some sort of a thing where, like, this was a ritual that they did that sort of brought the tribes together a little bit, but then here's an incident that kind of, broke it again, that the redemption ritual is like the tribe's ritual where they, like, were on better terms with each other or something like that. Like, a show of trust between the tribes of, like, okay, this year you deliver it from your gate to ours, next year we'll do it the other way around or something like that. But obviously if someone steals it, it's a big problem. I don't know. I'd like to know what it is. Like, the orb, like, what is it? Because we've seen some stuff about, like, special orbs, like directing sunlight before. What's the connection here as such? It's an interesting one, just to think about. And like you say, if they had come back to it, like in Bossing, say, we met these two tribes together, they're settled, that's a way to immediately bring, like, the leaders back in. They could come back for the invasion because they're both pretty good sword fighters. And if they maybe did figure out the actual history and what the deal is, would be interesting. Where are they now? I'd be 100% up for that, because at least with these two tribes, there's like an interesting history compared to, like, them just introducing a random new location. Is interesting to me. Let's go on with I suppose the Canyon Guide and Aang have a little bit of an interesting dynamic of, like, both being put in the middle of kind of feuding characters. The Canyon Guide himself always has to be fair and impartial to get people through with no problems, and Aang as the Avatar is also going to have that approach as well. And I like the quote, lonely isn't it, being impartial. And it's not a huge, like, lesson necessarily that the Canyon Guide teaches Aang, but just, I suppose Aang realizing that there are more people than just the Avatar who have to deal with this same kind of problem. And if the Canyon Guide can do it, so can Aang. And we see him, handle a few issues right at the start, like between Momo and Appa, between Katara and Sokka. He gets a bit frustrated with the two tribes, of course, and they have to go separately. And then he, of course, follows all the rules, but he's the only one who, in a way, like, doesn't eat, even though everyone else does. And he gets quite frustrated by that. But Aang is pretty good throughout these episodes, just, doing his role, I think rightfully getting very frustrated with everyone, but being a very good leader, actually. I think he, shows himself quite well in all of this. Especially, like, in the middle of the fight, because he's the most powerful bender here. He really shows that, because he's the only one that's, like, properly able to, like, quote-unquote defeat a canyon crawler, using the food to cover their mouths and, like, ride them up the cliffs. Very Aang move, because he likes to ride animals, and he teaches the others how to do it. And I thought it made for a nice kind of, like, triumphant end to the episode, to see that all of the kind of pairings to do the sort of lure the canyon crawler in were always like a Ganjin and a Zhang having to do it together. And then Sokka and Katara had to do it together. The two sides have to come together to win. That's a nice little detail to have. So I actually, like, most of this episode, I think, is pretty well, like, put together overall. But what were your thoughts on the Canyon Guide and Aang, and just, I suppose, Aang throughout the whole episode?
Yeah, I think, it's a learning experience for Aang. Like, it's not one that has, like, well, I mean, to the two tribes, it seems like it's a huge thing, right? But, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like the hugest issue, but it's still, an important learning point for Aang in terms of, dealing with his sort of Avatar duties. Like, Katara, like, right in the beginning, she calls out that Aang, can probably figure out some resolution to things. And, not that he necessarily, figures it out from the beginning, or even by the end of it, he has to make up a way to actually sort of resolution for here. But it shows him just sort of competing ideas and different ways of doing things, and maybe having to give up a little bit of his own well-being, and just in terms of like transporting some of the people across, just to get the two groups to somewhat work together until the end, where they do actually work together. So I mean, I think it's an episode that's not like hugely detailed or anything like that, but it drives the points that it's trying to make in a very sort of clear and deliberate manner, which for the overall audience that the show is actually geared towards, especially in the early episodes before things get really sort of deep. I think it does a really good job of that. Like, you can clearly see, even if you're probably a younger person, what they're going for here, how you're supposed to sort of attempt to work with other people and stuff like that. So I think it does a good job of that, even if it isn't like the most standout or interesting episode or action-packed episode, which I think there are a good bit of action in this, especially like you mentioned with like the canyon critters and everything like that. So there definitely is a good bit going on in this episode that does make it pretty watchable. Like, it doesn't like kill you or anything like that, to sort of like see how the progression of events go across the whole episode. I think in some cases it might be even easier to watch than some of the other ones.
Yeah, like when people say, if you're doing a rewatch, just watch everything except The Great Divide, I always kind of go like, why? Like, why just skip this one episode when, like, this compared to say like 108, the waterbending scroll, like, I don't think that like that episode is that much better than this one, in terms of like sort of underutilized, newly introduced characters, a main plot dynamic that isn't like super strong. They're pretty on par depending on what you actually like from the episodes. The final point I suppose we have to talk about is Aang lying to the two tribes. Some people bring this up as like a bit of a kind of negative point, that you have to lie to the two tribes about their kind of important history to get them to work together. Is this a really bad thing that Aang does here, or is it a really helpful thing? I think it's one of those things where you see that the hatred between the two tribes is obviously founded to a certain degree because they believe in their history, but when they realize that they can work together and they sort of complement each other, but still ultimately both make the decision to be like, but history is still history, so we have to fight each other. That's when Aang is just kind of like, okay, no, okay, I'm going for this, and he lies to them about what happens. Because, I don't know, it might be a funny moment if they ever come back and they consider this game to be an actual, proper part of their history. Maybe they figure out what actually happened and they're like, no, it was good that you did that because we needed to learn to work together. It was a lie that led to something good happening ultimately, that the two tribes together, more of them are going to survive on their pathway to Bossing Se than otherwise. I don't think Aang's too much of a problem for doing this. And it's one of those ones where like a lot of people who bring that up are the people who like really just in general don't like the episode. So it's kind of like, why do you have a problem with a sort of dismissive ending if the episode overall is dismissed and so on? It's a bit weird. But what are your thoughts on Aang's lie? Do you think that this is a problem that Aang did this, or was it reasonable for him to do this given the circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, to stop sort of like this feud happening that, could have potentially ended up with both of the leaders or one or the other sort of, dying or anything like that. I mean, it seems like this would be the path that, a nomad, an air nomad might take in this sort of case here, especially with their more sort of like, I guess, joking nature that they have. I mean, I don't know. Does it seem like it's going to really affect things overall too much? I don't know. If they find out that this isn't the truth or whatever, are they going to start back up the blood field, or will they already be past it at that point? I mean, I guess that's kind of hard to judge from just what we see here, especially since we never see them again or anything like that. But I don't know. I mean, this is also like a new young Aang trying to fulfill his Avatar duties, so he's, attempting to do the best that he can do here. I mean, could there have been another situation that he could have chosen in this case? I mean, yeah, maybe he could have blown all of them away, right? Like, he still has, massive airbending abilities, so I'm sure if he really wanted to, he could push them all apart. But, would that have been a better way of going about things? I don't think so in that case. I think this is probably like one of the lesser evil ways of sort of resoluting this sort of issue that they're having here. And if it turns out for the better, then all for it, I guess.
I think for me, one thing I would have liked the episode to have done is just like right at the end, you just cut to another flashback and you show what actually happened. And you maybe get across that maybe like Aang's story is closer to the truth than you maybe thought. But like highlight that, okay, there was actually something important here. Both tribes were sort of correct in one way or another, but actually, like maybe they are twins. Maybe that part of Aang's story is correct, because it is notable that their names are like Jin Wei and Wei Jin, like just the parts like reversed. So there's obviously a connection here with the tribes and whatever their histories are. So it's like we were just talking about throughout the whole thing of like, they chose to end the episode on a point that sort of made the episode feel inconsequential when they didn't need to do that. They could have made this episode feel important in that, like, if they came back to this one in a similar way to, say, like Avatar Day comes back to Avatar Kyoshi, and you had a follow-up episode that actually treats the backstory as being, like, important, and, like, what if they found the Sacred Orb again, and it's actually something important that like Aang needs? There's a way to do something that's actually really interesting, but they chose not to. So it's an interesting one. There's some potential with this one. I would actually like to see more on the two tribes, but we'll see what happens. From there we move into the Korra episode for this time out, and that is K108, When Extremes Meet. This is my favorite book one episode. I think I have like my fourth overall favorite Korra episode. I really love this episode. I think it's fantastic. The Korra Tarlok dynamic I think is so well done throughout this episode. I love the intensity that builds up over the different scenes. So you get the idea that by the time their conflict happens, that they really do hate each other, and then obviously it has one of, I think, the biggest shock reveals in like all of Avatar at the end, which is hugely impactful. And then just there's loads of other points in the episode as well, like it's the formation of like Korra's team Avatar here, so seeing them out on patrol is pretty nice. And there's a few nice scenes, like Korra and Tenzin have a nice scene. There's good stuff, I think, all the way throughout this, even some of the funnier stuff right at the start. So I think this episode does everything it needs to do, and it's kind of, for me at least, it's kind of close to one of the perfect episodes of Korra. But what are your thoughts on now, When Extremes Meet?
Yeah, no, this is definitely high up on my list of favorite episodes. I think it does a really good job of really kicking things off. I mean, I guess you could say, the whole thing with the arena was like the real like starting point for the war, but this is where you really get to see things going with Korra and her core group here, as well as, the whole shock reveals and stuff like that. I mean, I think from when the episode first came out and seeing what happens at the end of it, it really sort of started to get people sort of thinking about things and who's the real sort of like villain in this show or in this season, and just sort of how everything was going to progress. So there's definitely like a lot that gets done in this episode, and you get to, understand that things are really coming towards like a particular point in this one, even if you don't quite know all of the details and everything that's happening behind the scenes. I mean, for this sort of episode that has, maybe like really only one part that really directly, has like a big fight with the Equalists. Most of it is just sort of like intrigue and everything that's going on around the current situation of everything in Republic City. So no, there's a lot going on this episode, a lot of action, a lot of build up to the whole rest of the season, really.
I suppose just to start off at the start, like the scene where everyone arrives on Air Temple Island, because of course Mako, Bolin, and Asami all need somewhere to stay. They're allowed to stay on Air Temple Island. There's some cool scenes here because it's for the most part like the first time us getting to really see, like, say, the Air Kids interact with the rest of like Korra's friends. And so like Iki and Bolin is a surprisingly interesting dynamic that sort of works perfectly. She just like lists off all these facts. Everyone else is kind of stunned by it, but Bolin asks a bunch of questions. She immediately responds. Milo has a crush on Asami straight away. There's interesting things here, and you see that in a similar way, like with Air Nomad culture, that they have the north and south temples are separate from the east and west. That they have a sort of like men's wing of the island and a women's wing of the island, and so you get that sort of split at the start as well. And it leads into like a little bit of a plot point here of like Iki reveals to Asami that Korra likes Mako, which sort of alerts her to sort of be on alert for that in the scenes as when they're Team Avatar later on, and you get the Asami look. It's not a huge focus of the episode. It's literally like maybe 20 seconds of the episode, but it's something to highlight that Asami is now beginning to sort of see the kind of chemistry between those two characters. But it's a very fun initial scene, just seeing everyone here on Air Temple Island. What were your thoughts on that?
I agree that this is a fun start to it. I think, considering how serious and, maybe somewhat dark the episode gets by the end of things, I think it's really nice that they start off with, a bit of levity of things, especially considering the previous episode where everything was just going all over the place. I think they did a good job at starting it with sort of these lighter moments, these little fun call outs, Iki having sort of like the fun sort of like, out of your typical style of character or drawings and designs in this one, so they do a good bit of that here. And even later on they have a couple little segments of comedy, mainly with Milo, that sort of balance out things that happen throughout this whole episode.
The next scene I think we should talk about, is the Tenzin Korra stuff, since I guess we'll talk about the Tarlok Korra stuff a bit later on. Their talk is very interesting because it happens just after basically Tarlok insults Korra about not being like a fully realized avatar, hasn't completed her training, still can't do any airbending, and it highlights a few things that she hasn't accomplished yet, which is that Tenzin is kind of like, oh, well, maybe talk to your past lives about airbending assistance. But then she reveals, oh, like, I've never had contact with any of the past lives either. But then Tenzin kind of gets you to think about, like, has anything that might in any way resemble a past life communication happened? And she remembers the little flash visions that she's been having, the hallucinations about Aang. And he's just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Meditate on those. And he presents the idea that Aang is likely trying to tell you something through them, which is actually correct. So Tenzin is correct about this. He just, I suppose, doesn't exactly know what way to make the visions more clear. Interestingly, it turns out that meditating is actually the way to get this done, but Korra needed the development to fully like connect in that way. So a nice scene, and like it highlights like the Korra Tenzin dynamic is one of the best ones in Korra. So it's nice to have a scene here where he is like a proper mentor to her here. He doesn't have the solutions necessarily, but he's pretty wise about this and understanding about this situation, because Korra, as we see here, does struggle with the idea that she isn't good at something. So missing a whole element and the spiritual side, like she feels like she's missing like 2/5 of what it is to be the Avatar. That's a big deal for her, and Tenzin helps her a little bit here. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think Tenzin, throughout this whole episode, he does a good, job of just being there for Korra. I think, from all the previous episodes, they've, developed this more, mentor-mentee sort of relationship that actually, like, sort of works in most cases. Korra, was realizing that she doesn't necessarily know how to do everything. And unfortunately, Tarlok's, like, throwing it in her face, despite her, really doing a pretty good job of, as much as she can up until this point, and focusing on what she really needs to. But you can see sort of like the animosity that the two have against each other is really sort of like coming to a point here that just really just builds as we get to it later on in the episode as well here. But no, I think it's a good point here to just sort of show, this is sort of bringing Korra down to a certain point where she's actually willing to actually have help coming up soon from her group of friends.
And that's the next scene, which is she sits on her own on the edge of a cliff, which is sort of her go-to thing. We saw this in the first episode as well. We see it in the last episode of the season as well, that she goes to these places to look out into the horizon when she's struggling with things. And this is where we get our kind of Korra team avatar formation. Mako, Bolin, and Asami come over, and they just they are the ones to bring up the idea that, like, what about Aang? Look how young Aang was when he was fighting the Fire Nation. Like, he wasn't ready for everything. He had his team. You have a team as well in us. And so she latches onto this idea of, like, oh yeah, she has these people with her and they can be a new team avatar together. And so they go for it here straight away. They put their hands together. Milo farts on it, of course, but fun moment. They initially kind of want to use Naga as their sort of mode of transportation, but because Naga's not as big as a Sky Bison, that's not going to work. Maybe two people at most can really go on Naga, but it doesn't work here. But Asami does have a car, so here we get the introduction of the Avatar, which is kind of cool. And also Asami is now part of the team, so she is going to use the shock glove as like her main kind of weapon here. So cool stuff here as the team goes out on patrol. I think it's a nice scene that in ATLA the team sort of forms itself because Sokka and Katara find Aang. Here the characters have been introduced for quite a while, so it's nice that they kind of see her in this moment where she kind of feels alone, and they're the ones to be like, we'll help you in these situations, like we'll be a team for this. So I quite like this scene and what they do here, and they kind of highlight the modern edge of like, okay, yeah, we need to use a car to go around, not a giant polar bear dog. So fun stuff. But what are your thoughts on the team coming together?
Yeah, no, I think it feels like maybe it's like the more mature way for a group to form, since they are quite a bit older than Aang and the original sort of group of kids that were working together. Kids tend to just sort of like be around each other, and they just sort of form the friend groups where if you're a little bit older, sometimes it takes a little bit more work to sort of get to that point here. So it felt like it was pretty natural. I mean, they all knew each other to some degree, some more so than others, and three of them were already essentially a team in pro bending. So, just including Asami in the group just, sort of worked in terms of everything like that. But yeah, no, and then the whole, idea of the minor edge of the car in order to sort of get the group to move around, that also feels, very on point for the modern times that they're in as well. I mean, I think there is a point where we do see all of them on Naga, but, for regular transportation, especially when you do actually see how they get around in the episode here, Naga probably wouldn't have been sort of the best case solution for that overall. So no, I think they went with the right choice for that.
And they jump into pretty much straight up an action scene here. I suppose getting to see Team Avatar in action. Very cool, like kind of chase sequence here. They're in the car. The Equalists are on motorbikes. It's a Equalist jailbreak here. Lots of great stuff to highlight here. Mako uses lightning quite a bit. One of the Equalists even gets on the car. You see Asami shocking people while still driving. Some earthbending assisted, like fancy driving maneuvers. Lots of stuff going on here. I like how casual Cora is in a bunch of these situations as well. Like, she could do all this stuff, but she just like pulls the guy down next to Asami, and Asami just goes zap and takes him out. Pretty good teamwork straight away as well. So obviously none of them are probably used to bending at full speed in a car, but it made for a very, very dynamic fight scene, and a plot point that they very publicly they solve this issue. They capture all the jailbreak equalists, and in the media it's like, wow, Team Avatar is here, a brand new Team Avatar. The Avatar does this on her own. Tarlok's task force, which has just been kind of connected to the actual police force, were nowhere to be seen. This is a major step in that plot between Cora and Tarlok as well. So it's not just an action scene for the sake of an action scene as well. It has plot relevance. But what were your thoughts on this quite impressive action scene? One of a couple in this episode.
Yeah, no, I think it works awesome in the way that they're sort of showing the whole idea of, how they first find out about it, how they, sort of understand like the whole police scanners in the car, and that's how they actually hear this, and they just happen to be in the right location for them to actually sort of take participate in this. And yeah, I mean, even if they, they're all pretty proficient in their skills and driving and what they're able to do here. So, it makes sense to some degree that they're able to work together. Not that they come out completely unscathed, like, Bolin does get, chi blocked at least on one arm here. So, they do have a little bit of trouble, but, they're really good at what they do here. So, and they, try to do it with like almost like the least amount of effort. Like the whole idea of just like shocking and just, throwing them out the back seems to work really well in this case, especially if they are driving at such high speeds here. But yeah, it definitely does put sort of a bit of a damper on Tarlok's sort of goals with his task force, which I don't know. I feel like he probably wouldn't have been able to sort of like get them, if it wasn't for the new Team Avatar here.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose we need to bring in some of this stuff. Like, yeah, from earlier on in the episode, Saikan becomes the new chief of police. It's abundantly clear that he's like basically sort of being paid off more or less. He kind of agrees with Tarlok, so Tarlok has control of the chief of police, and the police will work directly with the task force. Cora refuses to join the task force, and this leads to the scene I mentioned earlier on of her kind of being like, I'm the Avatar, I can do things on my own, like you need me more than I need you. But he's kind of like, you're not even a full Avatar, and that gets her down until Team Avatar forms. This is the highlight scene for Team Avatar, completely outstaging Tarlok, and all the time, the anger is rising here. He brings her down, the team brings her back up, she has the advantage. But then we get this very, very interesting scene. It's probably one of the, in terms of like non-action directly scene, the most intense scene of the episode. The next thing that the team responds to is like these disturbances at the Dragon Flats borough. And this happens just after we get the council scene, where Tarlok makes it illegal to even be associated with Equalist, and enforces a curfew on all non-benders, with Tenzin being the only one who disagrees with it. So we really at this point see the power, control, manipulation Tarlok has over everyone except Tenzin. But because Tenzin is just one part of the council, there's nothing he can do to stop this. And it's pretty crazy what we see here. Just these non-benders basically being forced, like their power is turned off. They have to get back into their houses because it's past their curfew. All just because they're non-benders, and there's a non-bender group going around doing things. It's Tarlok going to his extremes in this episode. And it also brings up, I suppose, the media aspect of this, of like Cora and Tarlok are the big public figures in all of this, but they can't do anything to each other in public, or they look like the worst like villain imaginable. Like Tarlok can't be seen to necessarily like arrest or attack the Avatar in public, and the same with her to a councilman. So I love the dynamic here where they just have to sort of do what they can to each other without looking terrible in front of everyone else. So Tarlok uses this situation to like arrest all of Team Avatar because they're not like an official like organization here, and Korra only isn't arrested because Tarlok can't be seen to do that. And Korra is put under a lot of pressure in this scene because the non-benders really highlight that you're our avatar too, you know, please do something if you can. But Korra, you know, at this point doesn't really know what to do, and you know, the only thing she feels she can do is get physical with Tarlok, but she can't. I really like that scene where they sort of zoom back and it's Korra holding the two giant rocks in front of Tarlok and him just being able to completely talk her down logically through it. So really, really good scene as we just see like a kind of helpless Korra here, as you see, I suppose, Tarlok just see how he deals with the Equalists, which is by going too far. What are your thoughts on this whole complex sequence here with the non-benders and the abuse of power by Tarlok here?
Yeah, I mean, it really highlights what, Korra says later on of him just, doing everything that benders can do to sort of really abuse their powers and their abilities towards, people who don't have those abilities here. And, from the outside perspective of what we're seeing, it looks pretty clear, but, when you're sort of mired in sort of, the situation of things going on, which I guess you could say is what Tarlok's dealing with, he can't quite see everything that's really going around. I mean, just the idea that, he can sort of pass this sort of law and, have no other pushback other than Tenzin, which isn't enough to really, change anything in this case, just shows you that it's just sort of like, it's really too far gone at this point. And yeah, it definitely does seem like it's quite extreme. Like, he's calling it like an equalist rally here, but as far as we can tell, there's nothing, close to what we've seen at an actual rally. So, where is he getting his sort of like information or perspective on certain things? And, just the idea that you're going to be processing that many people, like that seems like a lot to do at one time. So, it's, I don't know, it definitely is sort of like an extreme situation here. And Korra's really she's not prepared yet in order to face people, without using her sort of physicality, because still at this point, that's really all she knows. Like, she's a little bit more patient. She has, a little bit more understanding of bending forms for air bending. But, it hasn't quite clicked with her. And, she's still relying on Tenzin for the more subtle approach to things at this point in time.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because even if she, in a way, like, did have the right things to say, Tarlok fundamentally would be the person she's trying to say them to, but she is not going to be able to convince him because he's the one who has the, the power to actually change things. Because otherwise, it's Tenzin who she knows is on her side, but the other council members agree with Tarlok. So this highlights, I suppose, the problem with the current system, which is obviously that there are way more non-benders than there are benders, but the whole council is benders as far as we're aware. So I'd love it if they ever kind of clarified the statistics on this in terms of like how big of a difference there is. I'm guessing it's at least like, say, like 66% of people are non-benders and it's maybe only like a third of people who are benders, if even that. Just kind of highlighting the problem with the system here, and that like if there were more non-benders on the council, I don't think what Tarlok wants done here would ever happen. But obviously it's a complicated situation coming straight after like a major like terrorist incident like what happened at the arena. People want something done. And even though Tenzin's correct, he's not really offering like a solution to it. So Tarlok using like the nuclear option seems like the only solution. Otherwise, it's just almost like slow, ineffective, slowly going after like known groups of equalists, and he wants something done straight away. It's interesting, like the complexities of the situation when you look into it, and that Tarlok, especially like when you like know the full story about him, it's interesting to see like him manipulating his way to the top in an official position, but then like abusing his powers here to get done what needs to be done, but not really helping people in the process. And again, I think we had this discussion before, but the idea is that I don't think it's that he's like anti non-bender. It's more that like he's full on anti equalist, but in a way, to be effective against that, he comes across as anti non-bender. It's a complicated situation. But what are your thoughts on that? Like why Tarlok goes to such extremes here, in that like just with the police thing already, he sort of has the power that he wants. Why does he, in a way, like turn so many people against him to get this done and go so hard against the equalists?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point to make, because it definitely feels like, like he doesn't outright seem like he's against non-benders, or at least most of what we've seen doesn't, particularly indicate that, despite, being a bender, being, probably, a proud bender, and even having, these other abilities that, we don't fully understand at this point. It just seems like he's really, I don't know, maybe it feels like he doesn't have quite the full grasp of the whole equalist situation. Like he only sees sort of like the terror that they're causing, and not necessarily the more like nuanced side of things, which, to be fair, like, when you're in that sort of situation, you probably wouldn't, understand the whole situation, and you probably need someone else to sort of like balance things out. But it doesn't seem like the council itself is necessarily in position to do that, especially if we're considering them all to be benders, and Tenzin's probably the only sort of like more level-headed one there, which could just be from his upbringing, or just his natural affinity for his element that sort of has that, and the other elements don't necessarily have that. But yeah, Tarlok definitely feels like he's just pushing his own agenda, which, might also just be part of his ploy to just get more power, even though he already seems to have, pretty much a full handle on the council. He still has to work with them. So maybe there's just more aims and goals that he's really going for that we're not, totally privy for.
And there's also, like, I suppose, bringing in stuff from towards the end of the season, in a way, like the kind of curse of that family, of like they all inadvertently end up going down the same path of trying to achieve power in some way, and ultimately like doing it the wrong way. That it's always, just some way of trying to keep power. Like Yukon did it from the underworld, Tarlok's doing it like the right way, but like doing illegal things to get the position, the valid position, and then the more sort of like rebel / terrorist way through Oman. There's also that kind of sense of things, of like he's inadvertently kind of becoming his father in a way. So this brings us to like the last sort of sequence of the episode. They try to get like Mako, Asami, and Bolin out. Saikan's not going to help them. They have to talk to Tarlok. But Korra refuses to wait even like another day to make this happen, and she goes to confront him. And I like the little scene before that of like she's just lying in bed and she just can't go to sleep. She's just lost in thought about this situation, in that like that sense that Tarlok has just gotten to her. And then you see when she arrives that Korra has gotten to him, and like they're both ready to just like explode at each other here. The dialogue's very good here. Korra accuses Tarlok of oppressing and intimidating non-benders. He accuses her of the same, in the sense that like, why has she come here? What was she hoping to do in coming here? She doesn't really have too many talking points to highlight here. So in his mind, she has come here to intimidate him into freeing her friends. And so that kind of hits her a little bit. But he does point out he likes that they both go to extremes, which is why he wants her on the task force, because I suppose from his point of view, he feels like if he had the Avatar, then he has the whole city. He has every power in the city at that point, but she refuses. And the big point here that starts the conflict is that she says that he is just as bad as Amon. And this makes him like absolutely lose it. Like his eyes go big, and as she walks off, he attacks her from behind. So, interesting that in a way you think Korra is going to be the one to start the conflict, but it's actually him that does it, and that Amon comparison. Interesting because Amon, at this point, he doesn't know Amon is like related to him. So it is more of the case that I suppose Amon is the person he is doing everything he is to try and like defeat. Like he's the direct opposition to Amon. And so being accused of being as bad as the leader of the enemy seems to really get to him, in the same way that like insulting Korra's avatar skill is what gets to her. I really like their dynamic ahead of the fight. So just in terms of the dialogue of their before their conflict, what are your thoughts on the dynamic between these two?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Korra really has a good grasp of the situation here. Like, she's been enough around to understand, what the other side feels, which, that could have been, from the fact that she's gone to the rally, even if, her whole reason for being there was just to save Bolin. Like, she has, learned over time being around, in Republic City, even the person that she herself, harassed a bit to figure out the rally, can see the other side of things and can really see, how there are some benders, and she's including Tarlok in this now, really do sort of like use their powers, for their own sort of gains here. And, yeah, she didn't come to this sort of like initial meeting with like enough sort of like counterpoints and arguments, which, it's just part of Korra's character. Like, at least at this point in time, like she's not really, savvy enough to have, all the arguments without, getting some sort of physicality, but she doesn't, like you said, she's not the one that sort of starts this whole altercation here. Like, she's really just, she's attempting to talk her way out of the situation, but she just doesn't have the talking points to really, back up anything at this point. She's just sort of like repeating the same thing over and over again, which, Tarlok knows isn't enough to change his mind in any sort of situation here, and he's just pointing that out to her. But the initial conflict here really sort of just highlights everything that they're doing and everything that they're doing that's wrong. And
this fight is it's definitely one of the best that we get in Korra in terms of just like two benders fighting each other. It's like it's big bending attacks, it's violent, lots of powerful attacks. And we see that Tarlok is an incredibly skilled waterbender, does some very cool attacks that we've not seen any other waterbender do before. Korra gets cut like all over from his like machine gun waterbending ice attack, and she has to go huge with the earthbending to sort of stop him and get him away from the big source of water. And she's just wrecking the place because they're having the meeting in like the city hall here. So she like blows out the wall, she sends him down to the ground by blowing out the kind of like upper level, and like dives down at him, big earthbending kind of like bomb as she lands. And the big thing here is like Korra like nearly kind of like loses herself in the intensity of this battle, in that she rushes in at him with firebending when he has like no water. So like, what was she going to do if Tarlok didn't do what he does next is an interesting kind of point in an episode called When Extremes Meet. But the big twist here, Tarlok doesn't attack and stops Korra completely in her tracks, and it's revealed to be bloodbending. But more than that, we kind of cut up a little bit and we see that the moon isn't out. It's only like a partial moon, but you need the full moon to do bloodbending as far as we're aware. So what's going on here? And Korra's like shocked by this. It's just like, how are you doing this? And he just kind of says that there's a lot you don't know about me. And so Korra's knocked out. He drives her out of the city to be held captive with the idea that this is him taking the Avatar, the only opposition really he has left, out of the picture here. We get a final vision, because it's revealed in the next episode, of someone doing bloodbending effectively. Sokka is affected by it, Toph is affected by it, Aang is, just highlighting that, like, oh, I guess there's a connection between Tarlok and what's going on, which is kind of interesting, and you begin to be able to sort of figure it out a little bit before we actually get it revealed next time out. But what are your thoughts on this fight, the big reveal, everything here at the end of the episode?
The fight is awesome. I think most people say that's one of the like highlight fights, especially for just two powerful benders, in somewhat a confined area, just going at each other. I think it does a really good job of highlighting their skills and sort of what they're used to using. Like, Korra doesn't use water really in this fight at all. Like, she's using sort of like her default fallback sort of techniques and stuff. So that just shows you where her progress of things overall actually is. But I think that the fight is cool. You really get to see, sort of real sort of like damage in a fight. I guess, we've seen that before to some degree, but I think it really gets highlight here, which just adds to sort of like the brutality of what they're actually doing in this instance here. And then, the whole idea of, Tarlok being able to bloodbend without, the full moon, shocks, our main character here, and us as viewers, especially if you remember the original series and how important that was to things. That's one of the things that people always mention about the show, and especially this episode and the first season overall. I think that was like one of the biggest things when that first was sort of revealed at the time here. But definitely sort of, it's something that, really does a good job of like equalizing, the abilities that the Avatar has that otherwise would be pretty like overwhelming in any sort of other case. Like, if he didn't have that ability, he probably wouldn't have won this fight. Like, there's pretty much no way that you could see that working, even with Korra not having airbending at all at this point. I don't know, maybe there's some other technique he might have known or something like that. That's water, I'm sure, if he's that high level of a waterbender, he probably could have pulled it out of the air or something like that. But would that have been enough to combat the Avatar in this sort of case here? I would think probably not, but this ability that he has, and what we find out about it later on, eventually neutralizes the Avatar in this case. And you can see that even our previous Avatar from the flashback is also hampered by this ability. You don't understand the full context of it, but that there's something important here. And when we do finally get all that revealed, it's really cool to see how that plays out in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah, like this episode really highlights that it's kind of crazy the importance of some of the things revealed in the next episode are, because Sokka like revealing that there are like just these unique powerful benders is like such an important thing to understand in terms of like the potential of like power level of abilities and stuff like that like this is just a unique family of benders that sort of can break the otherwise things we know as rules of bending and so on. And we learn little bits and pieces about like, like bloodbending's outlawed, and that's also another shocking aspect to it, that they attempt to sort of like hide the ability of bloodbending so no one knows it in the first place. But then there's this secret family of powerful benders and so on. It's kind of hard to really put into perspective that back at the time, like how significant of a like mystery this was, in that it's already in a book that has this kind of crazy mystery revolving around like Amon, and the whole idea of, well, he told us he apparently gets this ability from the spirits, but I don't know if I should believe that or not. And now all of a sudden there's this other character who can break the rules of how bloodbending works. Like, what are we meant to assume here? And in terms of like, this is where all the crazy theories were coming out, because until Sokka says what he says in the next episode, like, you don't really know what to make of this as such. But it's put nicely into kind of perspective next time out. So huge shocking moment, one of, if not maybe the biggest like surprise moment. It's interesting that the next episode has an equally as big moment right at the end as well. But yeah, like really, really fantastic stuff in this episode, start to finish. And what is so interesting that coming out of this is that Tarlok is right up there. Like this book has two big villains. That Amon has done something huge, but now Tarlok has done something equally as big, and you're kind of waiting for the two to kind of come to blows here to see, like, how's this going to work? This amazing non-bender who can take bending away and seems like to just be able to walk through benders, can he counter a super powerful bloodbender like this? Like, it's set up like really, really nicely in this sort of battle of the villains with the hero taken out. So I like that setup as well, that I think everyone always highlights. Amon, obviously, but Tarlok's a really important player in this book as well. But what are your thoughts on like where just this crazy ending like leaves the book and its plot?
Yeah, I mean, I think having two strong opposing forces that are both on sort of the bad side of things is really, something to behold, because they're two separate forces that are going against, our main hero type character here, and both seem equally strong in terms of what they're going for. So it's really, I guess it's one of those strengths of the first, season here, just showing that they really tried to go for like as much as they could, and eventually they do come to a head, and you get to see who's the eventual sort of victor and how they're related to each other and how that all works out in the end. But I think when you don't know that in the beginning, or even if you're just watching it, even keeping that in mind, it really just sort of stands out that there's really two huge things that are going on in this city, both not necessarily like entirely positive or negative depending on your perspective, that Korra has to deal with her group and team that is kind of out of commission right now, and even she's going to be out of commission for a bit as well. So it really just shows you just the danger of everything going on.
So yeah, that is our Korra episode for this time out. And we'll move into the final part of the episode, which is 112, The Storm from Avatar. So a key episode here. The flashback stuff was teased and hinted at in 103, but we get it sort of properly, more or less in full in this episode here. And again, they do it in the sort of dual Aang/Zuko style, where they both get their backstories explained and different circumstances, but they're connected through like the idea of the storm. So I suppose the easiest way to do this is to just cover sort of like the present day story and then focus in on the flashbacks after that. There isn't too much to the present day story in the sense that, like, on the Aang side of things, they need money. They go to this port town. They find a fisherman and his wife arguing. The wife senses a storm is coming, but the fisherman wants to go out to sea. She refuses to go. Sokka gets hired. Easy way to make money. And when the fisherman realizes Aang's the Avatar, he basically criticizes the Avatar. And it's one of the first times we've seen a character find out Aang is the Avatar and kind of rip into him over the idea of basically you not being around is the reason we've had 100 years of war and the situation that we're in. And he effectively says, why did you run away? Which obviously, triggers the idea that this is what Aang ultimately did, and why he wasn't around is because he did run away. And this sets up Aang telling his backstory to Katara. And then on the Zuko side of things, Iroh senses the storm is coming, and Zuko refuses to kind of heed Iroh's advice. And he doesn't care about his crew initially. That's what he says. I don't care if the crew, the safety of a crew doesn't matter. This causes Lieutenant G to sort of step up as a character, conflict with Zuko. He thinks Zuko has no respect. And Iroh feels that he has to explain to the rest of the crew what happened to Zuko. So I like the setup on both sides of the story for this. Obviously, I think the Zuko one's a little bit more like interesting because his crew finally comes into spotlight. But I also do like the idea that like an older person here kind of does highlight that, okay, it's cool that you're back, but you know, where were you, and being more critical of Aang. I like that comes up and that it actually upsets Aang to see that. So what are your thoughts on the setup, like why we actually go into flashback here?
Yeah, I think the setup works well. I think in terms of, you know, both of our sort of main characters in this episode being criticized on their action, you know, forces them to reflect on things. And he's already sort of been subconsciously reflecting on this through his sort of nightmares that he's been having, which, you know, Katara notes has been happening more and more often here. And, you know, Zuko feels like, you know, maybe it's like what Iroh says, because they've been on the sea so much, or just because of, you know, the recent string of events that have, you know, encountered Zuko, you know, has sort of pushed his crew, or at least, you know, the main one who's willing to sort of speak out to Zuko directly, you know, about sort of the situation on hand here. So I think the setup for both of them works pretty well. I like, you know, sort of the dream sequence that they have in the beginning with Aang, where it's like all nice and sort of surreal, and then eventually goes pretty dark. I think, you know, it's a nice sort of lead in to sort of, you know, the sort of, I guess, supernatural, flashbacky type of stuff that happens later on, so it's not sort of completely out of nowhere. But yeah, no, I think the setup and the whole idea of the storm, which, you know, of course the storm just ties in perfectly with, you know, Aang's story and how things went down for him, and sort of, you know, brings the whole sort of loop together from the past to the present.
We'll go into the Zuko flashback first, since it's slightly easier to cover. So Iroh tells the crew Zuko's story. A young Zuko wants to attend a war meeting. Iroh kind of urges him not to, mainly because it's boring, and he's just like, you probably don't want to see it. But interestingly, Zuko's just kind of like, oh, I'm going to lead the nation one day. I think I should be involved in these things. And we see that this younger Zuko, no Scar, is much more like optimistic, hopeful, happier, and he wants to go in. And so Iroh, you know, brings him in with him. In the middle of the meeting, a general stands up and is just like, okay, I want to put this division here. And someone else is like, but they're new recruits, they're not going to be able to win. And he's like, they're just a distraction while the actual unit comes in from the back. So sacrificing new recruits. And Zuko speaks out and is kind of correct here. You know, those new recruits, like, care for our nation just as well as the others do. Like, we can't just like abandon them and sacrifice them. So this is seen as being a major insult against the general and against the Fire Lord. So an Agni Kai has to happen. Zuko thinks he's going up against the general he spoke out against, but because it was in the Fire Lord's war chamber, Zuko has to fight Ozai. So he refuses to fight, and Ozai burns him for not wanting to fight. And because of this kind of shameful kind of act of not even fighting back, this is why he's banished and has to capture the Avatar. And we sort of end with the note that, like, the Avatar gives Zuko hope that things will get back to the way they were before. So the crew understands Zuko better. They're kind of like, well, I didn't realize that, like, his father was the one who scarred him. I thought it was a training accident. And they understand him better after this. Key moments in this as well, that, like, when the scarring scene happens, you see Iroh turn away, but Zhao watches it, the general he insulted watches it, and Azula makes her debut, also watching it with glee. So some really fun references here as well. But in a way, it's a surprisingly, like, simple story, but it's an important one to highlight the idea that Zuko is different before this incident and is completely changed after it. I like the little scene where they have the sort of kind of painterly style flashback scene of him being even younger than the flashback, very, very happy, and it just transitioning back to the present day scarred Zuko with, like, the angriest look we've ever seen on his face, to really highlight that this is how this incident has changed him, but that there's that more optimistic, caring character is still in here somewhere. We've seen little glimmers of it already, and we'll go on to see one after the flashbacks. But what are your thoughts on the Zuko flashback as it's presented here? We finally get the full story about how he got the scar and so on.
I thought that was really cool. I mean, I think that was something that, was really needed to understand Zuko's character and where he comes from and sort of his core, I guess, say motivations, his hopes, which is what Iroh notes here, that nothing will ever be sort of the same as it was, but there's a potential for things to sort of change, and that's really what has driven him so far. And the crew sort of gets a better understanding for this, and even waits for him during sort of the resolution of everything that's going on the ship. But the flashback itself is really cool just to see, Zuko from another perspective when, like you were saying, things were a bit more on the up, a bit more hopeful of things, how he really is, and probably was raised to really sort of, love the Fire Nation and to really want to support it in the best way possible. Just he's not quite as hardened as a younger person where, he really wants to see the betterment of his actual people here. And I don't know if there would have been a better way for him to sort of like breach that in the Fire Lord's chamber there. Like, would have Iroh have said something? I don't know. Maybe not, considering, Iroh's current standing of things in the Fire Nation at that point in time. And, if he didn't say anything, there's a good chance that nothing might have been said. So maybe that was for the best, even if it was, the worst possible outcome for Zuko as a character there.
Yeah, it's interesting in that, like, if Zuko maybe had like a better tactic, that might have worked, but he still could have been criticized for like speaking over like a higher ranked person or something like that. So it kind of feels like, in a way, like, probably the only thing Zuko would have been praised for is if he proposed an even like crueler tactic, kind of like a Zula style or something like that. But it's interesting. Like, one thing that comes to mind here is that this is like not like too far in the past. Like, it's only like a couple of years before the start of the series. It's interesting that like Zuko is left in a very terrible position. Like, the way like the Zuko alone flashback ends is that like his mother's gone, he's left with like his father who doesn't care about him, and his sister who's constantly like better than him, trying to manipulate him. It's interesting to see that he still remains like optimistic, hopeful, despite this like terrible situation he's been in for the last couple of years leading up to this incident, that he can still speak out for these people he doesn't know because he knows that this is a bad thing to do. Sacrificing this legion of new recruits. That's very interesting to me, that the terrible kind of treatment from what family is left doesn't like break him, that it's only the scarring, the banishment that does that. That's interesting to me. I suppose it highlights that like Iroh, I think, really comes into his life after Ursa leaves, and really kind of helps him through this. And you get that in some of the present day stuff, that the reason the crew is there is because of Iroh and the respect for him, not because of Zuko.
Yeah.
So Iroh has like really, really helped him like the whole way through. But what are your thoughts on that? The idea that Zuko, as we see him at the start of this flashback, is still like good, despite the awful position from like other flashbacks that we'll get later on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just sort of like a strength of his character overall, that, despite all the hardships that he's gone through, it still hasn't like completely like warped his soul or anything like that. Like, he still has, a core of his character that really wants, the betterment of his people overall, not necessarily like, feeling the need that you have to destroy other people, although, it doesn't seem like he'll, necessarily like back down or anything like that. but he might take a particularly like a different approach to things compared to like Azula or his father or anything like that. So no, I think that's just part of how they developed his character, which is why when he eventually does start to work with the group and everything like that, like it doesn't come across that odd or anything like that. Like his core character, even if he's just trying to capture the Avatar and hand him over to his father, he's not going towards the sort of like vilest ways of going about things that you potentially could do as a firebender or anything like that.
The Aang flashback is really interesting. So he basically tells the story of the day he found out he was the Avatar. So he's already a master. He has the airbender arrow tattoos already. He's teaching the air scooter, a move he's invented that effectively like earned him his tattoos, to his friends. He's brought before the elders and told that he is the Avatar. They confirm it by showing him the Avatar relics and being like, you chose these toys from thousands of different toys, and you chose them because they were familiar to you, that these are relics of past Avatars, past lives of yours. And this is especially interesting because like we just thought that, I guess all the nations use these Avatar relics and that's how they figure it out. But then the Kyoshi novels reveal that no, this is specifically the air nomad way of doing it, that these are things in possession of the air nomads. The other nations have their own different ways of discovering who the Avatar is. We find out that an Avatar is normally told when they are 16, but Aang is told here at 12 because there are troubling signs. Storm clouds are gathering, like war is coming. Now, that's basically alluding to the whole idea of like Sozin building up his military. I suppose the world being aware that the Fire Nation is preparing for something. Everyone will have already seen, I suppose, them occupying parts of the Earth Kingdom, the early colonies, and that they're preparing for a big military kind of expansion here. And that's why they tell Aang so that the Avatar is ready for what is to come. And it's weird because like they obviously characterize some of the elders here as being kind of like in the wrong for doing this, but ultimately this was kind of what they needed to do because of just the situation at the time. Like at the timing of Aang leaving, even though he blames himself, meant that the world still has hope. It's so interesting the way that this backstory goes. But anyway, in the aftermath of this, we find out that like his friends don't want to play with him anymore because whoever has the Avatar in the team is going to have an advantage. Aang just wants things to be normal and kind of use being the Avatar as like drastically changing his life. Gyatso is the only thing kind of keeping things normal for him, and Gyatso's trying to keep his life as close to the others as possible, protecting him from the elders wanting to like super accelerate his training and just do everything all at once. And it all changes when Aang overhears the discussion of the elders. They want to separate Aang from Gyatso and send him to the Eastern Air Temple to complete his training. And Aang, furious at this decision, decides to leave a letter and run away in the storm here, not accepting what's happening here. And this is what, of course, gets him trapped in ice and missing for 100 years. And obviously he blames himself for this, not being there to help his people. But Katara notes that, you would have been killed too. As terrible as it is, it was meant to be that you left. That way you are here to help people because you give people hope. So I like that both flashbacks sort of end with the idea of like the Avatar gives people hope, and on Aang's side it's like the general thing of like, yeah, having the Avatar here helped to end the war, but that the Avatar is also the only thing in a way keeping Zuko sane almost in a way, keeping him on any sort of a right track. I like the exploration of the just learning more about the temples and in the Aang backstory. Seeing the way that the leadership is, of course, having a group of elders here, and it's obviously the intensity of both stories is kind of slightly different because Zuko's one is like being scarred by her father, and then Aang's one is more of like if they could mention more openly the Air Nomad genocide, I think, you know, his side of the story would be much more intense. But when you know what comes, it makes a lot of sense, and especially watching the episode now, the troubling signs, storm clouds are gathering, really hits when you know what's actually happening behind the scenes. But what are your thoughts on the Aang flashback here, getting more on the Air Nomads?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think it's intense for a different reason. It's more personal towards Aang, his character, and just sort of his idea of nomad culture and sort of, you know, I guess the idea of being free and doing what you want to do, and sort of, you know, the whole idea of him becoming in the Avatar, or realizing that he's the Avatar, you know, that really goes against everything that he's been brought up to believe, which seems to be what Gyatso's trying to keep Aang, you know, having intact, how he, you know, saying that he needs to grow up as a normal boy and, you know, not necessarily, you know, have all the pressure put on him that, you know, entails with being the Avatar, which, you know, again, you know, just goes to the idea of like, when do you tell, you know, this kid that, you know, they're the most powerful being in the world at this time, and, you know, that they have all this extra responsibilities. And, you know, we've noted earlier on that, you know, it takes Aang quite a few episodes to really sort of, you know, mature enough to really understand the concept of being, you know, the Avatar, which, you know, in the like direct line of, you know, how many days from when he found out he was the Avatar to where we are in the series, you know, technically it's not really that long, even if it has been over 100 years, but for Aang it really hasn't been. So, you know, it kind of makes sense in that regard of him like being able to understand what that is. And, you know, they mentioned that it's, you know, it's normally it's like around 16 when they finally do tell you, which I guess is, you know, what they're going to consider in this world like the default mature age, in order to like really understand that and, you know, maybe not run away from your problems, which is exactly what Aang does. And, you know, sort of feels like that might be sort of like the typical airbender response to, you know, a harsh situation, which is the whole, you know, issue that, you know, the old man brings up in the beginning here, which is exactly what Aang did. So I don't know, I think it's a really good flashback, you know, the whole idea of how the cultures work, how the leadership is, how there's other temples that they have the ability to send them to, you know, how that just all sort of plays into Aang's sort of fears and anxieties, you know, along the whole situation here. But, you know, they do keep the whole idea of, you know, that him being here at the time is what gives the world hope, gives Zuko hope, like you said, you know, keeps him sane to some regard. You know, it's predestined, or maybe it's not, or, you know, it's just good writing for the story, but, you know, it tends to play out in sort of like the best case scenario in this instance here. And, you know, with Aang being there from the back, you know, would he have been able to do anything? Probably not. So, you know, what Katara says in terms of like the final outcome for this, you know, probably is along sort of the best of the worst case scenarios in the long run.
Yeah, and then I also do like that there is the kind of point of like Aang is only 12 as well, that like because he isn't 16, that it does kind of change things, and that's why they kind of focus on the idea of just like, my friends won't play with me anymore because I'm the Avatar now. That's a turning point for him. But then there's also the more personal thing to Aang, that he is attached to Gyatso, and it's obviously like that's one of like Aang's character flaws, is that like he's too attached to the people he really cares about. And so again, like the elders are sort of correct in some ways, that they need to, you know, prevent that from becoming a, you know, major attachment for Aang. But obviously that's a huge part of his character, and again is fundamentally the reason he does leave in the end, is more so because of that than the way like his friends kind of go on to treat him. So very, very interesting, like to see the different approach of like the air nomads in preparation for like a war coming, feel that this is what they have to do. It's interesting. I'd love to see more of an exploration about this, where they could be a bit more open about maybe what they know is maybe about to happen. Because they do sort of have to still talk around the whole mad genocide thing, and that, I'm kind of thinking to myself at this point, like, is it really not until 306 that we can fully piece together the full thing and realize like the actual like full extent of everything that happened? But it's just interesting. So with the flashbacks out of the way, I suppose we just go to the end of the story here. So we effectively have like incidents happening because of the storm. So obviously like Sokka and the fishermen get caught out in the storm. Also in the storm, Zuko's ship gets struck by lightning. And so there's two crises that have to be resolved. And so Aang heads out on Appa to go after Sokka. And then Zuko and G have to save the helmsman, who's going to fall off the top of the ship. So lots of cool stuff happens here. So we get the first use of lightning redirection in the series. It's almost this kind of thing where like they linger on it for a couple of seconds, but they don't like tell you it's this like super important ability or anything like that. But Iroh fundamentally saves the ship from being destroyed with this ability. G and Zuko together save the helmsman, which is a nice little point highlighting that Zuko does care about his crew. And then when he sees Aang, come out of the water at the end, he decides to prioritize the safety of the crew over going after the Avatar. So he makes the decision that's correct, that the crew respects. So a big change in that, like the crew is now much more loyal to Zuko specifically as well. So that's nice. And then Aang gets a kind of partial redemption here by like nearly getting caught in the storm again, nearly having to go into the iceberg again. But this time he saves Sokka and everyone else by taking on the role of the Avatar rather than running away from it. So, really nice conclusion to this, using what was like the sort of issue from the flashback or what the way the characters' arcs have gone and reversing it here. So, just really nicely written on both sides, and just that moment of like Zuko and Aang looking at each other as like Aang goes out the top of the storm is really nice setup as well, because obviously next episode is sort of like a kind of key one in terms of like these two characters are like destined to like in a way like do something together. So what were your thoughts on the kind of finale of this episode?
Yeah, I really liked how things got tied together, how the whole, idea of both them being sort of affected by this storm and eventually coming to interact with each other, even if it's just sort of like passing there. It really does a good job of like tying these two separate threads, separate stories, separate backstories, into one, continual thing. I think, this episode does a really good job of highlighting, I guess, they're both having, traumatic past histories that, maybe they have something that they'll have to do together, maybe they won't, but, there's a lead into that potential, in both of their sort of cases here. And then you also get to see two pretty cool, parts of bending, despite the episode overall not really having, a lot of action in terms of that. It's more of like a history recap episode. But, Aang using his ability under the water, which is, of course, reminiscent of how he how he first time got stuck down there. And then, the whole lightning bending, which, like you said, it like, I don't even know, I can't remember that far back, like, if I noticed that as being like a cool moment or a highlight moment or something that's super unique in order to do. I mean, it just sort of seems like it's just something that Iroh does and he just saves the ship. I mean, sure, you can redirect lightning. Like, why wouldn't that seem odd? So, but yeah, no, I think it's a good way of ending the episode, and to add a little bit of levity in there as well on the sort of Aang side of things, with him sort of just coming to a realization of just how to move forward with things.
So, that is the Storm key flashback episode here. So, going forward, obviously, we're going to be, the next couple of episodes, we're going to focus on reviewing the Dawn of Yang Chen. So for the next bunch of weeks, we won't be doing the episode reviews. So I guess it's going to be on hold for like a month or so. But when we do come back, we will be reviewing the next batch of episodes. It's just going to be, I think, one of each episode. So Blue Spirit and also Out of the Past for Korra. So I think that's a really nice selection of episodes to sort of, if things didn't go well for Avatar, what I suppose would have been originally the kind of finale of the show, because it was 13 episodes they were kind of originally kind of scheduled for before everything else got confirmed, and the big original character flashback scene from Korra that everyone freaked out about. So two very, very memorable episodes coming up next. So what are your thoughts on that duo?
Yeah, no, those are always like highlight episodes that people always seem to like mention in terms of like, I guess the history of Avatar in general and how important they were if things didn't go, or just sort of getting all of our sort of like nostalgia vibes for previous characters in their sort of updated form. So no, those are both good episodes.
So and then like the final thing, like I said, with that on break for a little bit, the next probably 3 episodes, I think that's the way we did it for the 2 Kyoshi books, and it's the same way we're going to do it here. So we're basically going to break the book down into thirds. First podcast will be the first third of the Dawn of Yang Chen, second third, final third, and obviously we'll cover news on those shows as well and anything that happens, but we're going to be Yang Chen focused for the next while. I obviously got the book quite early, so I've been Yang Chen focused for like all this month so far already, so it's going to be pretty exciting. But I suppose one final point, Greg, is just what's your excitement level going into the Dawn of Yang Chen? You've seen people get it early. We're only 3 days away now. What are your thoughts heading in?
I'm pretty excited for it. I have seen some people talk about it. I've seen mostly positive things. So no, I'm definitely curious to get into it and read it for myself.
So yeah, Dawn of Yang Chen out on the 19th. Get the book. Follow along with us for the podcast reviews, which will be coming. We still have to organize it because like a book, it's a large piece of content. Maybe next week, maybe we'll start it the week after. We'll see. But other than that, that has been episode 247 of the Avatar Online Podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for watching, and bye.
Bye-bye.